Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order this session of the Tacoma Park City Council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart. Here. Councilmember Kovar. Here. Councilmember DeBala. Here. Councilmember Kostick. Councilmember Siemens. Councilmember Smith. Councilmember Searcy.
Welcome, everyone. Let's see, we have one change to our agenda this evening. We are dropping the resolution providing for an appointment to the Grants Review Committee. That's not happening this evening, and we've changed the date for our work session on the Recreation Center Community Engagement Contract. So, moving forward, on Wednesday, February 19th, next week, our work sessions include our stormwater fee system, code amendments, and communication approach, continued discussion of the Resolution 2020 Climate Emergency Response Framework, and our quarterly financial report. Then on Wednesday, February 26th, our work session will be library renovation update and a request to close Ann Street on Saturday, May 2nd for Crossroads Spring Fest. On Wednesday, March 4th, we have the presentation from the Council Compensation Task Force report. And tentatively scheduled, we have a resolution on the 2020 Climate Emergency Response Framework, a resolution authorizing closure of Ann Street for May 2nd. Our work sessions include election code amendments, a recreation center community engagement contract, and FY 2020 budget amendment number 3. And that's what we have to date on that. Legislative updates. It's been a busy week. Things are in full swing in Annapolis. I was actually up there today. The community choice energy bill that Delegate Charkoudian has put in, the hearing is tomorrow, and I know our staff, along with the Crossroads Development Authority, are helping some of our businesses get to Annapolis to testify. We've put in written testimony on Delegate Corman's State Highway Pedestrian Access Bill that had a hearing today. We put in written testimony for that. We put in written testimony in for Delegate Lehrman's plastic bag ban. And just to note, there's another bill that Delegate Charkoudian's putting in to help with low and medium income households on energy efficiency that will come before us too. So lots going on, a lot of testimony, a lot of work. Now we'll move on to public comments on voting items. Our one voting item this evening is a resolution approving request to close Laurel Avenue for events on April 25th and June 12th. Any comments on that? Seeing none, we'll move into our voting session. This is a consent agenda. Would someone like to move it? Councilman DeBala moved. Councilmember Kovar second. All those in favor of the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right. That will now take us to other public comments, and we actually have a treat tonight. Someone who actually interned with City TV and produced a PSA is with us this evening, and Leanne is going to play the PSA for us, and then Marika is going to tell us about the project she's working on.
I don't think it was you.
In Montgomery County alone, 44.4% of middle schoolers and 18.9% of high schoolers had reported being bullied at their school. This spiked my curiosity, and I decided I wanted to ask my friends about their experiences with bullying. This is what they told me.
A mí, por ir al consejero, mi peso y por usar maquillaje.
My eyebrows,
I was bullied for being half American and half Arab.
my body and gender.
Who were they?
Fue mi equipo de water polo.
I was bullied by my classmates.
Random kids, classmates, bus kids.
Where were you bullied? I was bullied in school.
Fue en la escuela y también en el bus.
School.
61% of people who answered said that they had told someone. 39% said they didn't. I asked if it ever stopped, and if so, how? Yes, I started to defend myself.
Yeah, they forgot I existed or that they bullied me in the first place.
No,
I then asked what advice they would give to themselves back then.
Ignóralos. Ellos están viviendo su vida y tú debes vivir la tuya.
Don't care so much about what other people think.
You shouldn't care what other people think because, in the end, their opinions don't matter.
I knew bullying existed around me, but I never thought that it would be so incredibly close. What I'm deciding to take away from this experience is advice to ask your friends and listen to what they have to say. Who knows? Maybe you'll help them start talking about it.
Thank you, Marika. Oh, wait, I have to turn on your microphone. Hold on one sec. Great. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the project and what you're working on now?
So I was invited to participate in a PSA making workshop with the City of Tacoma Park TV, in which everyone was supposed to write, direct, edit, and produce their own PSA. What we had to do is we were supposed to choose a topic that we thought was most pressing in Montgomery County and address the people affected by that issue. As a student in Montgomery County Public Schools, I knew that bullying was a topic that needed a deep dive. I decided that I would create an Instagram survey for my friends, of which 96% of my own friends who answered responded saying that they had been bullied. There was remarkable consistency in the responses. My friends were sharing their stories about bullying that happened on school campuses, buses, and after-school teams. The Montgomery County Cooperation Council posted statistics that I used in my PSA, which you just saw. In 2013, 44.4% of middle schoolers and 18.9% of high schoolers reported being bullied at their own school. From 2016 to 17, there were 870 reported bullying incidents in Montgomery County. With the help of the City of Tacoma Park, Tacoma Park City TV, my parents, and my friends who were lovely enough to help me in acting in this, we got together and filmed the PSA. Now what I'm trying to do is get many of my peers, basically, to start asking their friends about bullying experiences, to shake off the stigma, and so it's peer-to-peer, so that you can get more comfortable with discussing hard topics like this. I'm asking the residents of Tacoma Park and everyone on the council to watch the video on our website, askaboutbullying.com, and to share the site with the students that they know. We're not going to end bullying unless we start asking about it. That's all.
Great.
When you say on the website, when you say on the website, you mean on the bullying.com or you mean on the city? For the
Our
PSA.
website.
Their website, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. And do you want to repeat the website?
It's askaboutbullying.com.
Okay. Great. Terrific. Well, thank you so much for doing this with City TV and coming to share it with us.
Yeah.
And
Thank
please
you.
keep us updated on all that you do.
Yeah, I
Great.
will try.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your resources.
Yes. Nice, Rika. Great. All right. Any other public comments this evening?
Good evening. I'm David Blackstein. I'm from Sycamore Avenue in Ward 3, and I want to thank you for your time in consideration of how to protect our urban forest and how the tree protection policy helps to achieve the city's forest protection goals. I'm submitting these comments as a city resident for more than 24 years. I've used the tree protection policy to remove dangerous and dying trees on our property, to purchase and have trees planted on our property, and to successfully appeal a neighbor's attempt to remove a healthy tree, and even got in the Washington Post because of that. I'm also submitting these comments as a scientist with a PhD in ecology. So these are kind of general comments, but first, I think that the city's goal of maintaining a diverse and large urban forest that supports multiple objectives, including ecosystem services and human health benefits, is paramount. This should continue to be a citywide goal. The city must look carefully to ensure that the forest protection plan, including the cost of tree planting, replacement, and perceptions about bureaucracy and costs of tree removal permits, are not barriers to having trees in the less affluent areas of the city. There has been, over the last few weeks, as you know, a lot of comments about the climate protection plan and the role of trees. I think it's important that as you move forward on the what's really a sustainable energy action plan, that you provide a parallel but not offsetting process for the trees and the forest. The climate emergency can be used as an umbrella to advance policies that are both sound and unsound. Sound policies are those that help to mitigate climate change and adapt to climate risks. These emphasize the retention of urban forest and tree canopy to reduce the urban heat island effect, cool individual homes, and store carbon. Sound policies are those that favor planting native Maryland trees such as tupelos that are adapted to warmer conditions instead of other Maryland species such as birches that are more suited to cooler conditions. There are more than 20 species of oak that are native to Maryland and that are adapted to a variety of climatic and habitat conditions. Unsound policies are those that replace trees with non-natives in the supposed name of climate resilience, that unnecessarily remove healthy trees because of supposed hazards, and that have foolish options such as creating solar panel opportunities by cutting down trees. Thank you for your time, and it's essential that you see the forest for the trees. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. Any other public comments this evening?
Yes, I guess I got
So
there
take your
just in
time. Don't don't rush. Take your time.
Could I talk about trees as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, my name is Victor Tironi. I live at 201 Hodges Lane. And I'm actually a legislative drafting professional as well as a policy analyst. So just to give you a heads up, there are a few drafting issues with what you have in front of you, but I don't have time to get into those, but I just wanted to give you a heads up and I can follow up. I wanted to focus on one policy item, which is the kind of this, you're subsuming what, now we have a tree permit waiver and a tree permit. So there's the separate concepts. And the draft gets, consolidates those two. And I think that that is a mistake from a policy point of view. It also makes a drafting more confusing because then you're going to have to make cross-references and say, as said in subsection 3, and they get it wrong. They get the reference wrong in the draft. So, it makes it harder to read. But also from a policy point of view, this comes from sort of a tunnel vision that a legislature gets when it's focusing on a particular issue, and then it's, like tree permits, like how are we going to regulate that? What you need to do is look at the context. So the alternatives are, that homeowners can do. They can fail to plant a tree. They can fail to take care of a tree. They can cut back a dead tree. All of these actions are not regulated. There are no requirements to plant any replacement trees. But then you say, oh, well, if you apply for a permit, then we're going to impose a fee and all these requirements. It's bureaucratic. You have limited resources. You're going to need time to enforce these things. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't, from a policy point of view, you need to strike a balance between people applying for a permit and the rest of the context, which is actually a much larger population. So figure out how you can influence those decisions that homeowners take. It's going to make it hard if you require someone who cuts down a dead tree and gets a permit to replace or pay something. It's it's going to make it hard to enforce. If I have a tree that's dying, I'm going to cut down the dead branches. I don't need any permit for that. I'm going to cut down some of the canopy within 10%. I don't need a permit for that. So I'm going to end up maybe with a trunk there, and maybe I cut a little bit off each year. And I don't know at what point I need a permit for removing that or not. And I don't think you want your staff to go around inspecting that kind of situation. So I really urge you to keep the current distinction between the permit waiver and the permit. They're different concepts. One should be appealable, one shouldn't. And that'll be better. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Victor, and if you want to send any other comments, to my attention or to all of us, feel free, okay?
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments this evening? No other public comments? All right, then, we will then move on to our work session, discussion of draft language on potential changes.
Did you want council comments?
Oh, I just skipped over them
I said you
completely.
don't have
I did. I
to.
really don't, actually, no. I just wanted to get into the trees. I did. I was so anxious. All right, council comments. Who wants to comment tonight? Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. Have the sad news to report that Norman Ridgway, an activist from Ward 4, a longtime activist, passed away, and we will be holding a memorial service on Saturday, February 22nd at 2 o'clock at the Franklin Apartments at 7620 Maple Avenue. Encourage anyone who'd like to pay their respects to him to attend. And that's all. Thank you.
Councilman DeBala.
Yeah, a couple things. I mentioned this last week, but I'll mention it again. Lincoln Avenue, traffic calming, a neighborhood meeting on March 5th, which is a Thursday, at 7 o'clock to talk about speed bumps and traffic calming and all the pieces of that that have come up over the past few months. Separately, on Lincoln Avenue, there's been a fair amount of listserv traffic about the potential mural, which is great, and some comments that I'd like to get bundled and get to the city staff to consider. But also this Saturday in the neighborhood from 3 to 5, there's a little library building workshop, and part of that is going to be a discussion of the mural. So for anyone who's interested in the details on that, who lives on Lincoln Avenue, just get a hold of me. Secondly, in another neighborhood, Long Branch Sligo Neighborhood Association is meeting this coming Tuesday night, February 18th, at 7 o'clock on Hilton Avenue, 7302 Hilton, and the topic is going to be the proposed climate action framework. That's going to be, I think, the only topic. So that should be a good discussion. That's a lot of people in that neighborhood interested in that. And last but not least, I had a great weekend. I really enjoyed myself at Play Day, and I really enjoyed myself at the library fundraiser on Saturday night. And thank you to all the library volunteers and to the Play Day volunteers who made both of those events happen. Very special for the community. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Councilwoman Costick.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick things. I want to echo Councilmember DeBala's thanks for both of those events. I had a chance to be at the Play Day and see Jamie Raskin lead Simon Says, which was fun. And there was a fun magician here that a lot of the kids enjoyed a lot. So it was a great event, as always. I have also been working with Councilmember Searcy and the mayor and the Crossroads Development Authority to organize a Shop Purple Day on February 22nd. It's a Saturday from 10:30 to 1. It's an opportunity for residents, specifically for Ward 3 and Ward 6, but anyone is welcome to come out to the Crossroads area.
Ward 2 interlopers.
Absolutely. You are more than welcome. Come out to the Crossroads and have a chance to tour some of the businesses, shop at the businesses, get to know the owners a little bit, and really help out at this time when they're struggling a lot because of the Purple Line construction impacts. The hope is that you'll have a chance to maybe visit some new places you haven't gone before, And also then to bring that back and share that with your friends and family so that other people will also start going out and helping support those businesses during this pretty difficult time for them. Kind of as a companion to that, I've also been working with Laura Barclay from the Old Tacoma Business Association on a possible event in March that we could do something similar with as well. I believe the city manager is going to have some specific details in her update tonight, but we learned at the Access for All committee meeting, which I chair for the Council of Governments, that there are some changes proposed to WMATA fare structure as well as some service routes as well, for particularly impacting Tacoma Park for buses along New Hampshire Avenue. So I appreciate that Roz looked into that a little more deeply and has some information about the impacts on Tacoma Park. I encourage people to take a look more closely and see what you think of the proposed changes. It would involve some reductions to, I believe it is early morning and late evening service to a couple of the routes along New Hampshire Avenue. And there is an open comment period right now. There's a survey you can take online at wamata.com, and I believe an opportunity as well to present or send comments to the board on that. And then finally, I'm working with the Waco Neighborhood Association to plan a meeting in early March. So stay tuned for an exact date and some details on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a few quick things about some other levels of government that we interact with that people might find of interest. First of all, today, and my colleague, Councilmember DeBala, was there, as well as the city manager and others today when County Councilmember Hans Riemer came by the rec center on New Hampshire Avenue, and there's been a series of visits by the county council members, organized primarily by with the staff and also friends of the rec center. Priscilla Labovitz and others helped set that up, and so Hans was the latest one who got a tour of the site, and we just hope as we get more deeply into the plans for renovation of the rec center that we'll be able to potentially get some help from them. We originally had been scheduled to talk about that tonight. We're not going to, but we'll be talking about that soon. So I'm pleased that Hans Riemer was able to attend that. Also, just in terms of county council members stopping by things, Will Jawando, who's another at-large member, just came by this evening at 6 o'clock to tour our library and to participate in an author event there. And the mayor was there as well as the city manager and other staff, and yeah, it was the author was an incredible husband and wife team who've written a series of books about the Great Migration and some other aspects of African American history, particularly in the for kids. The books were, and again, having a member of the county council see the kind of programs that we have at the library is really great. And then the other thing is, and this is for anybody. Monday the 17th is District 20 night in Annapolis, so that's when our Senator Will Smith and our three delegates, David Moon, Lori Charkoudian, and Janelle Wilkins, host an event, and it's a dinner. It's in Annapolis from 6 to 8 p.m., and anyone is welcome to attend. You can get there yourself, or there is transportation being organized, and among other options for that is through Will Smith's office, and I'm just looking at if you send an email to info@williamsmithformaryland.com and send that to the attention of NOAA. They're picking people up in various spots. And I don't know whether the city's maybe going to do something.
The city's helping out with that. It's also in my city manager comments, the link, so somebody can get to it.
So we'll talk about that. But it's a great opportunity for residents to interact in a sort of more casual setting with our state legislators and do it in Annapolis and find out the things they're working on, and it can also be fun, so people should feel free to participate in that. I'll definitely be there. Thank you.
Great. So I think the only thing left for me to talk about is Councilman Searcy held an event to talk to residents last Saturday at Sardi's. I just want to thank her for doing that. We had a great conversation on the climate emergency response resolution. And so it's always nice to get together with folks over food and have discussions about the things that we're working on council. So I just wanted to thank her and to the residents who came out last week. And I will also be at D20 night in Annapolis, so I hope to see some residents there. And now with that, I will turn over to the city manager.
Thanks very much. I do have in my city manager comments, which are on the website and also in the Tacoma Insider. So make sure people sign up for the Tacoma Park Insider if you haven't already to get the real scoop on everything. But it does have the links for the information about the District 20 night event and for transportation if you would like. Piggybacking on one of the comments, the Friends of the Library fundraiser raised $2,300, so that's a big deal. I appreciate that. We are trying to have different departments kind of report out what they're doing, and our HR update is nice. We're doing union negotiations with both of our local collective bargaining units. We are getting some new staff. For some reason, they're all coming on March 2nd, so we're having to get to March 2nd before we fill those, before we have somebody to help with the positions. We always have positions that we're recruiting for, so people can go to the careers site on the city webpage. I wanted to just make a note about kind of some confusion over decorations in B.Y. Morrison Park. Some of you may have noticed some of the decorations in the park over the last few weeks. Recently, some of the direct decorations were delightful Valentine messages from children that was done in conjunction with our wonderful crossing guards, asking them to write about people that they care about. Unfortunately, communications about those decorations and what that was all about really weren't widespread. I didn't know, for example, as like many others didn't know. And like any public decorations, there's mixed opinions about what they looked like and how they were. The decorations were removed yesterday by one of our crossing guards. Her belief was that the Public Works Department was going to be removing them, and there was no order for the Public Works Department to remove them. There had been efforts by Mayor Stewart and Councilmember Kostick actually to try to keep them for a bit. And so I'm just asking that in the future, as these various kind of friendly initiatives pop up, that we communicate about them so that we can share that information, and if there's a way to do a win-win project, that's what happens. And, you know, just thinking Valentine's Day, I just want to wish everybody a happy Valentine's Day coming up. I try not to think of the constant yield number coming. Just, there's that. One of the things that I do have in the city manager report are some of the points out of the WMATA's proposed budget. Is very complex, so people do need to look online about the impact on their particular bus routes that they use. For example, there's, a lot of people are worried about cutbacks, but there are some things that are actually increased. So there's increased weekend frequency on, for example, the F4 line. There's some extended hours on some of the Metro Extra limited stop routes, which includes the K9 route, which is on New Hampshire Avenue. But then there's also reduction of hours of service, generally eliminating the first or last early morning or late night trips. And those include C4, which a number of people ride on University Boulevard, the J2, the K6. So these are things that if there's a particular route that you are interested in, it is worth going to the website and really looking and delving into that. And there are the hearings that are coming up. That's all my comments.
Great. Terrific. All right. Those were city manager comments. And now we are ready for the work session of all work sessions. And I don't know where Councilmember Kovar just went. But I am actually turning this meeting over to Councilwoman Kostick, Dabala, and Councilmember Kovar. The trio who has been taking on the task of collecting information from our urban forest manager, our public works director, our tree committee, and just thank you very much for all your work on this. And I think I'm turning it over to Councilman Kostick first.
Great. Thank you. I'm happy to see our audience filled up a little bit more. I was starting to feel like nobody wanted to talk about trees today. So we are going to talk about both the tree ordinance and also a possible resolution, a proposed resolution that we are looking at tonight. to sort of take the work we've been discussing regarding the tree ordinance and broaden it out a little more. One of the discussions we've had a lot throughout the past, probably about 2 years, I think is when we started this process, has been that we don't want to just focus on the tree ordinance. We don't want to just regulate how trees are removed, but also to encourage people to plant them and to look a little more holistically throughout the city at how we can support the tree canopy. So tonight we are going to start off with the ordinance, and then after we do some of the more technical things related to that, we will move into talking more about the resolution. First of all, I want to just start off by saying a big thank you to our tree commission, which has been spending a lot of time reviewing the ordinance and doing a lot of great work recommending to us what they think needs to be changed. The ordinance tonight comes to us with recommendations from them, as well as recommendations from city staff, our urban forest manager, and public works. This was drafted by our previous city attorney, who recently left, and we have our new city attorney here tonight. Thank you very much for being here. And he is still kind of getting up to speed on the ordinance, and I'm sure we'll have opportunities as we move forward to talk about specific wording and some questions that we have. But we appreciate you being here tonight. So I'm going to start off and kind of walk us through on the second page after the cover sheet. There is a list called Additional Information, Context, and Key Issues. I'm going to start off just reviewing this list of a summary of changes that have been made in this draft ordinance on things that mostly reflect discussions we've had previously, so I don't anticipate there should be a lot of discussion or follow-up that needs to happen here. I know there are a few questions, so we can get to those, but that'll be sort of a quick overview, and then we're going to get into some of the more meaty discussion for tonight. So in the ordinance, some of the things that have been amended include a general reorganization of the information that is in it, particularly related to permits. So you'll see some sections where there's a lot crossed off. That's mostly because that information has just been reoriented to a new location to make it a little easier to understand. Formalized and bolstered requirements for removal and protection of trees on city property. A new provision allowing the city manager to make regulations requiring certification of proper disposal of infested trees to reduce the risk of infection, which is something that came out of our concerns regarding the infestations that have been happening with the white oaks in the city. A more detailed explanation of what a tree impact assessment is, and I believe there were a couple of questions regarding that we want to discuss tonight. New regulations for protection of trees in an emergency situation, which is something I specifically asked for, and I think the language in it is pretty strong, but we might want to discuss that a little further. Removing specific fee amounts and moving those things to administrative regulations to give us a little more flexibility in terms of changing those things in the future as we see fit without having to make a full amendment to the ordinance. Granting the authority to the city to require that a licensed professional prepare a tree protection plan in complicated cases. So not in every case, but if there is a particular situation where that's required, they would be allowed to do so. Removing the concept of waivers and requiring permits for all tree removals, which is kind of a shift in sort of the overall concept of how the ordinance works, and is something we probably want to discuss in regards to the removal and replanting charts, which we'll get to later in our discussion tonight. Removing, next one, eliminating the option to appeal the removal of trees that are in imminent decline due to significant defect or infestation, or when part of a tree is damaging a permanent structure, and requiring posting of notice of the tree removal permit in those cases. So just eliminating that additional hurdle for property owners to jump through if there's a tree that really needs to be taken down. Changing the option to appeal a tree protection plan from residents with a shared property line to the residents who have the tree, which is what it is right now, to residents who have a shared property line but also have a tree that may be substantially impacted, with a 15-day notice requirement. Adjusting a requirement that residents who replant themselves rather than paying the fee in lieu must provide certification of the planting and a photograph within 6 months. Also increasing the fee that we have for tree replanting, or the fee in lieu, so that it will include 2 years of maintenance, and this will help ensure that the fee covers the city's actual cost of the tree planting, and also helps to deal with one of the issues we've found, which is that residents sometimes just find it easier and cheaper to simply pay into the fee in lieu fund rather than actually replacing on their private property, which would be more beneficial for tree canopy support in the long run. A definition of what the tree fund can be used for to broaden its use and allow more activities to support tree canopy, and increasing the amount of a tree that can be pruned without requiring a tree impact assessment from 5% to 10%. So those are the things that we've previously discussed. Are there specific items from that list that people want to ask questions about to city staff or have a discussion about?
Yeah, so, I think so, all right. I did, right? All right. So I had a question on the tree impact assessment section. I know the urban forest, I was trying to find on my email, but maybe we can just go over my question. I know the urban forest manager answered some of this. So the section is 12.12030. It was just a little confusing to me the way it was written, because in the first sentence it says there's the assessment is a process, and then in the second sentence we say the tree impact assessment is a site visit by the urban forest manager, and that just seemed confusing to me. So I didn't know if it was meant to say both of those things or if we wanted to clarify.
This is something that came up when Councilmember Kovar and I were talking with our former city attorney, and we had raised a question also about the site visit issue. Would you be able to answer the question, just giving a clarification about sort of what is intended there, and also if a site visit is always required for an impact assessment or not?
Yeah, good evening. My name is Jan van Zutphen. I'm the urban forest manager with the city. For tree impact assessment, there's typically always a site visit, and typically with the property owner, if possible with architect or a contractor if available. And then I think one clarification that I put in my email as well, that it might be helpful to say the purpose of the tree impact assessment is, and then continue and take the process out, because I concur that it can be a bit confusing.
Great.
Or we could say it's a process that includes a site visit.
Whatever, I just wanted to make sure,
That's perfect.
And if I could just ask a clarifying question, because I think, we've all talked here about one of the main goals of redoing the ordinance is making sure it's really clear to folks what the process is. So are we saying that a tree impact assessment must always have a site visit? Because typically that's I feel like that's what gets into one of these areas that gets confusing for people then.
I would say yes, because it's really hard to do it without a site visit. There's so many, it's so hard to tell, exactly the details. So sometimes with Google Street View, it's helpful, but still, I typically just like to visit the site. And in the past, my understanding is that the urban forest manager just went to the site and assess the situation. I always like to meet with the property owner to kind of explain the process, and if needs be, if a tree protection plan is required, then to go over the tree protection plan so that they understand the whole process. Because that's, I think, particularly since people don't often deal with that, it can be a bit confusing, and I think I found that to be very helpful.
Great, all right, so we are requiring then a site visit, and it will be the tree impact assessment will be a process that will include a site visit. Okay,
Right.
Great. Did you want me to do the tree removal point too, or? Wait, hold
I
on, that one.
still have something on
Yeah.
tree impact
Oh, I'm
assessment,
sorry, go ahead, yeah.
And I don't know. So I may be back a step, because I thought we had talked about the occasional person who does deal frequently with trees and wants to combine a tree impact assessment with a permit at the same time. And I thought that we were considering that in some cases you could apply for both at the same time, and then the tree impact assessment visit could also be the tree permit visit. And I don't see that in here, and perhaps I missed the discussion on that, but that's what I was what I was thinking I was gonna see.
Sorry, do you mind repeating?
Yeah, so, so there's a tree impact assessment,
Yep.
and then that decides whether there's, you know this, but for everybody else. And that decides whether a permit is needed or not.
Well, tree protection plan.
Sorry, a tree protection plan is needed or not.
Right.
So in those cases where it's clear that a tree protection plan is gonna be needed, is it possible to apply for both at the same time, the tree impact assessment and the tree permit plan? So it used to be confusion. Some folks wanted to skip straight to the tree
Yeah.
protection plan. And so we would like to have them do the tree impact assessment, but I thought that we were gonna try to have it so that they could do the tree impact assessment and the protection plan at the same time in those cases where it's obvious that they're gonna need to do that.
Yeah, I would recommend against that. I would start with the tree impact assessment application, because then typically during that meeting, you know, as I said, I meet with the property owner, go over tree preservation measures that may be required. And that way they can understand, you know, the tree protection plan process better. If at times a contractor is there, I discuss with the contractor, you know, areas of storage, how much space they need. So each site visit is quite specific. And I think it's really beneficial from my perspective, hopefully it is really beneficial to the property owner, the contractor, or an architect to discuss the specifics of a particular project and go over what is required from a tree preservation perspective. And based on that, I think it will really aid whoever is preparing the tree protection plan and make it a lot easier, both for the applicant as well as for city staff.
So it may sound like it takes more time to go through 2 steps, but it's your recommendation that it actually makes those steps go quicker?
Correct.
And so are there then 2 site visits, or is the site visit only for the tree impact assessment?
Typically, the site visit is only for the tree
Okay.
impact assessment. However, in some cases, I may go back to review the tree protection plan if needed, depending on the complexity, if it's complex or not.
Okay. So again, just to be clear, in those more complex cases, so you would still recommend that we do the tree impact assessment with the site visit? And
Absolutely.
then from that, do the tree protection plan
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
hopefully not need a visit, rather than skip the tree
Typically,
impact assessment and go straight to we don't want to do that, okay.
Yeah, if I review a tree protection plan, I typically do not need to meet again with anybody. It would just be me going to the site. But the other thing I do typically during the site visit for the tree impact assessment application, I take pictures. So those pictures also help me with reviewing the tree protection plan. The other thing oftentimes I've done with people, so during the site visit, I'll use kind of spray paint to locate where, for example, tree protection fencing needs to go, where root pruning may need to be done. And then I also typically follow up with an email outlining the requirements, the tree preservation requirements.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Great. All right, so impact assessment we're done with.
Yes.
All right. And so do you want to hold the permit?
That's related to replanting? or-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's hold on that, if that's okay. Councilmember Kovar, I think you had, yeah, and you, do you have other
Yeah.
things?
This is in the weeds, and so maybe this is something I would email all of you about, but when I went back to the November and the version before that, the list of when a tree impact assessment is required, the second one, which has to do with whether roots will be destroyed, et cetera, there was the word significant in there, and we were talking about, I thought, how we might define significant, and that seemed awkward, but now it reads reads to me as if any root destruction, any soil compaction, anything would trigger a tree impact assessment, and I think that's not what we mean. So I just would flag, could we take a look at that again? That would be 12-12-030, the new A2. tree impact assessment when it's required. And so this is just a drafting question for the urban forest manager and the new city attorney to make sure that what is written here is in fact what we have all intended in our discussions. We don't need to discuss it right now, just flagging it.
Wasn't that the 50-foot requirement or something?
The 50 feet is still there, it's all the other stuff. Thank you. I think that's it for me. Would you have, on tree impact assessment, did you have anything?
Not specifically on tree impact, just on some other aspects of the list that the Councilmember Cossack just went through. I'm happy to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Casey's running it.
Well, so I do think it's worth just touching on, because I've been a little uncertain of it myself, what Mr. Tironi mentioned earlier. And so the logic for, is it a distinction without a difference to say that you either get a waiver or get a permit? Is that a meaningful difference? Ms. Braithwaite, do you want to comment on that? I'm okay either way, but I want to understand what we are doing and not doing.
Yeah, currently the way the ordinance reads, you get a waiver if a tree is dead or if it's hazardous. All other cases of tree removal require a permit. One of the goals of this current iteration was to try to simplify the tree ordinance so it made sense to people. When I hear the word waiver, I get a different meaning than what it is in our ordinance. So our recommendation was to eliminate the use of the term waiver, issue permits for tree removals, whether it's alive, dead, hazardous, in decline. All tree removals require a permit. Right now, all tree removals, even dead trees, require that you submit a removal application. So it's not changing anything in terms of what residents are required to do or the process. We're trying to simplify the language.
So in either case, you submit and get something back, you're just suggesting to call it something
Right.
different.
We used to give people a waiver, so they get this piece of paper that looks like a permit, but it's called a waiver. That says you can take your tree down, you just have to put this in your window for 7 days when you're gonna remove the tree. So now we're just gonna keep the language similar and call it a permit, whether it's a dead tree, a hazardous tree, or a living tree that you actually had a replanting requirement for.
Okay.
So the goal is to simplify the language,
Okay.
not really change the
And then,
process.
thanks, that's very helpful. And then I had a question for Councilmember Cossack, and it might just be that I'm not quite reading this correct, but since you wrote the summary on these bullet points, I'm just going to ask you, okay? So it's the one right after that, which is the, about the 8th or 9th bullet point, and it says, eliminating the option to appeal the removal of trees that are in imminent decline due to significant defect or infestation, or when the tree is damaging a permanent resident, and requiring posting of notice of the tree removal permit in those cases. So you no longer, once the urban forest manager or whoever approves the removal of a tree that's in imminent decline, that can't be appealed. But are we requiring posting, or are we eliminating the requirement for posting?
So my understanding of this is it related to our discussion, I believe, when the two of us met with Ken,
Yeah.
and we talked about having there be, that a property owner would put up something notifying people that what was happening, but that there was no specific time period prior to that. Like, it wasn't like you had to post and wait 7 days. It was just you put up a notice of
Yeah, it just
tree
said you had to
removal.
put the sign up for 7 days. The current ordinance just says you have to put the sign up for 7 days, so it can be very separate from when you're actually getting the tree removed. The goal, I think, is to let people know if they're concerned that, yes, I have a permit, here's the piece of paper, versus them calling us to
But
say,
there's
hey,
no waiting
somebody's.
period that they have to wait with the posting, is that right?
No, I think the language now in the new ordinance ties it to when you're actually removing the
7 days
tree.
after
So the
the
sign is concurrent with the removal of the tree, so that there's not a gap in time and
Okay, so just in case someone was walking by and said, hey, are you
Do
allowed
you
to
have
cut
a
that down?
permit?
Gotcha.
Right.
Okay, okay. That makes sense, thank you. I appreciate the clarification. There were a few other questions I had that just relate to the changes that are being made, and I don't want to go into the ones that are in the weeds now, but maybe I could just raise those and either Darrell or Jan could comment. Is that, would folks be okay if I just ask a couple of questions like that? So, in terms of the ability, and this is in 1208, 12.08.01, the city manager may promulgate regulations requiring certification of proper disposal of infested trees to prevent the spread of infestation. So this, as was mentioned, is in response to the situation with the beetles that affected the oak trees and so on. And I'm just curious, and maybe Ms. Braithwaite could answer this, is that enough, or should there also be something connected to steps that we would take to prevent the spread and so on beforehand? Or does that not belong in the ordinance, but maybe belong in our forest policy? That, I guess that's what I'm wondering.
I think of the language there is enough. I mean, in truth, what will likely happen if there is something that is impacting trees, it'll be the state Department of Ag that will regulate what happens. So we really don't want to get ourselves in a language situation that may be preempted by the state. When we have a situation where there's infestation, say emerald ash borer or other things, they're likely going to promulgate the requirements for that. This just provides the ability for the city manager to act. I think it would be obvious that it would be in a serious situation with cause for concern, and there would certainly be a lot of public discussion about it. So I think, given that we don't really know what the parameters might be, just to provide the information in there gives us what we need.
Okay. So if you could, if you don't mind, Darrell, I had another question too. So, and maybe Mr. Kornbergs can also weigh in on this. I don't know whether this is something that needs to be, number one, if you would agree with it, but even if you do, whether it needs to be in the statute or just in a regulatory material that would accompany it. But one of the things that's come up a few times is that when an outside arborist has submitted material and it's in a different format than what the urban forest manager had anticipated that it would be in, and I think we could eliminate those uncertainties if the form showed exactly what was needed. It seems obvious. Is that something we need to say here, or can we just assume it will happen, or would we make it regulatory?
I would think, given that we don't know what all the possible parameters of that, I mean, it happened, when it's come up before, it's happened related to resistograph evaluation, which is a very specific thing. It's oftentimes the case where the city tells an applicant, we're not giving you permission to remove the tree because we think it's okay, but you may want to get a level 3 tree assessment done. And so there is a standard in the industry about what a level 3 tree assessment is. And that's not defined by anybody here on staff, but actually, by the folks that certify these types of things. So in cases where we get a report back that doesn't offer a clear explanation, just provides graphs that are unexplained, we're going to say, we don't do resistograph readings. We can't read those graphs. You need to
Right, so I guess I'm
evaluate
asking,
it.
is there a way to avoid that happening by somehow showing in our forms or in our requirements that it's not enough just to submit the graph?
Well, I
or is
think
that
in
just-
most cases, when you're hiring somebody to do a level 3 tree assessment, and again, don't ever say most cases, but most folks understand that what you're asking for is not only for them to do the work, but also to provide a report that would justify their decision. So we could add language to that, but I'd be a little bit afraid that we'd be missing something or not, kind of tying it in too well. I think most folks that do that type of assessment not only do the work, but also provide a report. Typically, it's what is expected. Basically to justify their assessment and say, yes, this tree needs to be removed, or no, it doesn't, and here's the reason why. I mean, we can certainly attach credible reports that we've received before if somebody has a question, and I think in the case where it came up before, that's what we did. We said, here, take a look at this arborist level 3 assessment. That's kind of what we were expecting. And
Do you
then
think that's pretty infrequent that happened?
I can only think of one case where it happened
Okay.
before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. A couple other things, and then we can move on. So this is in section 12.12.080, and it's the tree removal permit standards and process. And this was originally the 9
Yeah, I wanted to talk about
criteria.
this too.
So can we hold off on that because that's going to be part of our later discussion?
We're holding off on it.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I think I just had one more thing to ask about. If you can give me a moment. Cindy, did you want to ask anything else, or while I find my last one? Maybe that was the last one.
While you're looking,
Yeah.
I've got a few things that I want to ask the city attorney about consistency and what goes with what, and not now, but I'm just saying I prefer not to do it now. I'd prefer to just make a list, just letting
Yeah.
everybody know.
Yeah, I also think probably as you go through this, it seems like you will probably find things that just, having two different lawyers look at something, you might want to rephrase something, or you might notice something that you're confused about, or just having another set of eyes on this. I suspect there may be things you want to make recommendations on as well.
Correct, but I also welcome any other readers' observations about the same thing.
Yeah, I think not everything got transferred, that's all.
All right, well then I'm good for now then, thanks.
Great. So those are the changes that are things that we had kind of previously discussed and should have been included in the ordinance draft. Now, there are also a number of things that are newer items that we're discussing more for the first time tonight. And those will include changes to the legislative findings section, which is sort of the broad overview of the purpose of the ordinance, rewriting of the tree removal permit criteria, which is what Councilmember Kovar and the mayor both had questions about, so we'll delve into that a little more. Removal of the exemption of replanting requirements for hazardous trees, which relates to the replacement requirement amounts and also the rating chart. So, and then finally, changes to the definition of the urban forest manager role. So we'll have, Councilmember Kovar is going to walk us through the legislative findings section and then the urban forest manager role, because those are somewhat connected as in the broad picture view. And we'll focus on that a little bit, and then we'll move into discussing the removal requirements.
Okay, so the legislative findings and purpose, and this could go in a different spot than it appears in the document currently, because in some ways legislative findings are in effect a general explanation of the purpose of this particular ordinance, and so one logical place to put that section might be after the definitions and before you get into the meat of the ordinance. So right now it's in 12.12.010, which I think is on page 9 of the version that I'm looking at. You could put that somewhere else. But if you look at that, you'll see, and we left one place in brackets because we weren't sure what to do with it, but it basically says that we find or determine or affirm that there are a series of 7 or 8 statements that serve to sort of create the infrastructure or undergird everything we're doing with the ordinance, and then it all flows from that. And so in some ways that relates also to the resolution that we'll be talking about later, and it meshes with the work that we're doing on climate change as well. But so if you look at that section, 12.12.01, I won't literally read it word for word, but it says first that it's in the interest of the city and the residents to protect and preserve and promote our urban forest. And secondly, the purpose of this ordinance is to promote a diverse, resilient, and sustainable urban forest through a stewardship process. And one of the questions that we had there, and we can talk about it when I finish this little introduction, is the extent to which we want to say the focus is on native species, or there's a desire to emphasize native species, or an absolute requirement. That's one of the things. Do we have desirable species, native species, et cetera? And I think it looks like that was left open-ended. So it's possible that we agreed to something separate on that. And then continuing on, it talks about how it's a community effort to do this. It's not just something that as a regulatory matter for staff, but that residents have a role in it because we all benefit from the urban forest. And then it emphasizes the need for a healthy, biodiverse, and demographically balanced forest with a contribution and a connection to our work on climate change. It describes the way the urban forest is connected to the watersheds of the Long Branch, Tacoma Branch, and Sligo Creeks, and how important that is to the downstream quality of those watersheds. And then it talks about the more aesthetic components of it, which are the beauty of the neighborhoods, impact on quality of life and health of residents. And finally, that it's essential that the forest policies and the canopy goals that we have to be pursued in a way that addresses inequities that may exist in the tree canopy coverage in the city and in other ways in terms of the health and sustainability of the urban forest as a whole. So those 7 principles we saw as forming the basis for what this entire ordinance is about. So the ordinance isn't really just about, we want to make it hard for you to cut down a tree and we're going to fine you if you don't do it right. It's not just that. It's about all of this. So it contributes in fundamental ways to some of the things that make our community great. And so I think it's important to have that in here. Certainly the wordsmithing would be possible to change that in various ways. I think it probably just personally makes more sense to have that near the beginning of it, maybe after the definition section. But that's the purpose of that. And if my colleague wants to just mention, we may have had a tentative agreement on language relating to native and desirable that we somehow missed picking up here as we were doing all this. I'm not sure about that, but I think that's the essence of what we've got here, and happy to answer questions about it.
Yeah, I apologize. I think we did have some language we were going to include there that may have gotten lost in there.
It's in the resolution, and where it came from, I think, originally was discussions that somebody had with Daryl.
But I think that was the
about
language
this.
that talked about native species or species that were adapted to climate change, right?
Right.
That was the
Right, it's right-
essence of it.
it's right here.
Yeah. Okay.
The other, 2 other things. One is in the annotated version that we got, there's 2 different versions of this language, and the first one is the one that you just talked about at line 249, and then at line 276, there's another version of it, and for people who are trying to follow along, I think we all are talking at this point about the first one that starts at line 250. And
Well,
not,
that's what
and
I-
not
that's what I
the
was
one that follows it, which has some notes in it about comments from different people, but they apply to I think to both versions. So I had that comment, and I also had a comment on a particular phrase, reducing the city's contribution to climate change is technically not exactly right, and I'll fix it and propose something different.
Okay. So, yeah, do we, I think,
Oh, should
do
I
you
read
have
it
the
again?
language that you,
Just
that
read that language,
is
yeah,
under
because we had
consideration?
agreed to it, and I didn't realize it wasn't there until just this
Yeah.
moment, so.
I didn't either.
No, I've lost it. Planting of native species that are climate adapted to anticipated future conditions. And there may be I'd like to get the tree commission read on that in particular, because they have a comment about how much do we actually know about which trees may be climate adapted to future conditions. So maybe we have to play with the words a little, but
So what
are you tracking with us here?
What the tree commission sent to us in their memo was a recommendation for saying planting a diversity of new native and/or large canopy tree species with consideration of the impacts of climate change. For what it's worth, that's what their recommendation was.
Why don't we table this and just, for now, because I think we had
Yeah.
something that was shorter than all of these that summed it up really well, that we had tentatively thought made sense rather than look through papers now.
I guess the only thing I was gonna say is that, and I don't know if it goes in here or this is in admin regs, but I think, Jan, you put this in your email response, and Councilwoman DeBala had brought this up, is if there is a list to point to give direction to for the city staff. My concern of not having something that's clear to the public, like this is the guideline we're following and this is what we're looking towards, because there are so many opinions on this, and even the language that we're reading here can be interpreted in many different ways. I'd like to have clear guidance specifically for the city staff on what we're saying we want planted, so that can be communicated to the public as well. Because I think we've had, over the last 2 years, we've had a lot of public comment on this and a lot of emails, and so as we're moving towards this, I'd like to have something that is clear that we can point to.
Yeah, so two different applications of the same concept. One is legislative findings, which I think can be a little more general. The other is in wherever it is in the ordinance that refers back to the species list. And what the species list says, get that section to be a lot more precise so that it's much more clear.
And I believe we asked the Tree Commission and Jan to work on developing a list. Is that right? Or updating the list?
Updating the list with reference to the University
Yeah,
of Maryland
first
work.
of all, it's a really hot topic. There's
Speaking
people
of
feel
Maryland.
very strongly, both sides of the issue. So I think in my email, I referenced the Casey Trees document,
Right.
which I think is very helpful. It's fairly up to date too. I think it's also will be changing. We currently have also on the city's website the 4-category list. But yeah, I think it definitely needs updating, but I think it's good to reference. We were possibly thinking to do 3 categories, small, medium, and large, to make it simple, and then that's also in line with the KC3 list. So I think the other issue is the climate adaptability. I think that's really hard to predict. I forwarded some information to you from the Forest Service and also from another organization. The only thing, the Forest Service, that was I think from 2007 or 8, so that's already quite a while back. So it's a bit hard to predict. I think there's definitely factors that can be taken into account.
So from my understanding of our previous conversations, it sounds to me like a number of us are interested in emphasizing natives when possible, but also considering climate change impacts. Does that seem like sort of where most people are?
And one suggestion had been native species and other species that may be adapted to a changing climate. But even that, to me, the native requirement or the native idea should be the entry point, and then we modify it if there's some reason why it's not appropriate based on climate change. And I don't know if it's possible to
I
be that
think
refined.
I've heard it said, by a person that, native trees are for native areas, and then certain native species and desirable non-natives are for non-native areas, such as street tree planting. So it's really, in my experience with street tree planting, it's the types of trees that do well in that kind of an environment. There's not that many of them. The other thing is if you have a cultivar that's disease resistant or disease resistant, then is that still native? Is it not native? So there's a lot of things to consider. I think it would be helpful to have some flexibility there. The objective, I think, obviously is to plant as many natives as possible, and also to plant as many large canopy trees as possible, with the understanding that you have trees need to be salt tolerant that are next to roads. The ash trees, we had a lot of ash trees. They have basically been eliminated from the options. Bradford pears been eliminated, and so on. So it's.
But your point is that climate's not the only type of exception that might make sense, because it could be the physical type of spot where it's being located near
Exactly.
the street, which could also affect it.
Yeah, and the right tree, right place tree for tree planting is really important as well, to take it into consideration.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, though it may sound a little bifurcated, but when you're talking about what trees you want to encourage people to plant on their lawns,
Yeah.
then I think we should go all out, push natives. Yeah, go native. When you're talking about trees in a very difficult situation, which street trees are, or trees that are impacted by parks and playgrounds, not every tree is going to do well there. So I don't like to put out that there's separate reasons, but there really, I do believe that for lawns and people's yards, you got a lot more space typically than we will have in that 3 foot of space between the curb and the sidewalk. So I don't know if it would be helpful to provide that kind of logic, in our bulk buy program and our tree planting program. We do want to offer and have available strong list of native trees for people to put in their yards. But when we're designing or selecting the trees for street right-of-ways, we're going to be much more limited in what we are recommending. So maybe we need to define that a little better so that people understand what we're speaking to when we're talking about wanting the options for non-native trees. It's really in those street side, difficult growth areas.
Great. Thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense to me. Is there anything else on the legislative findings section? Then, Councilmember Kovar, do you want to turn to the urban forest manager role?
We could do that. That appears at the very end of this version of the document, of the ordinance, and we hadn't completed editing and consolidating that to the same level that we had with the legislative findings. But basically, if you go to the very end in section 12.12.140, duties of the urban forest manager, and one of the reasons that we held off on it a little bit was because we did want to understand more of the extent to which people saw the role as not only comprising the various permitting components that we've discussed, and obviously it'd be great to hear what Jan thinks about this, but also the education and outreach component that we've talked about a lot. And is it realistic to build that into the description? Can that only be done if there's additional staff to assist that? I mean, I think Ms. Braithwaite has certainly talked about that possibility before. And so I think for some of us, there wasn't a complete understanding of the degree to which we could build in the outreach and education component unless we knew what that would actually entail, because I think the last thing we want to do is create all this additional work and then still not have it be doable given the current staff resources, and that would be a worse situation to be in. So I don't know if my colleagues or if the staff want to comment on that.
Actually, if I can just raise a question here, and that is, does it need to be ascribed to the urban forest manager or to the city? So, clearly the tree commission does education. There may be other education formats.
Mhm.
Neighborhood services team may be out there doing some education. So there's that. I think the education component's very important. The only other aspect, and it's referenced a little bit in some of the other parts of the language, is kind of clarifying that the urban forest manager is not a personal arborist.
Mhm.
And so that's the other thing that tends to be asked of him. And so those are just thoughts.
Well, so in other words, in that context, then, one way to think about the education and the outreach component of it is that it's something we want to do or have done, but it can be more broadly included within the resolution that we're going to be talking about. As this is one of our priorities, we have more work to do to figure out how it should be done and who would take it on, and whether it could be resident committees, other staff, et cetera, right? And maybe even our single communications staffer in the city. I mean, that, we have so many divisions with only one staff person, right? One lawyer, one sustainability, one urban forest manager, one communications person.
Yeah, I was just going to speak to, given the requirements of the law, and I think we've provided some pretty substantial documentation of the amount of the workload that's currently generated by the city's tree ordinance. And so basically, it's a full-time job to oversee the permit requirements, the applications, coupled with the expectation for doing planting on the city right-of-way, as well as maintenance of existing trees. So that really is more than, that's a substantial full-time job. I think the other point that I've made in the past is for education and outreach, I like Suzanne's point that there's a lot of ways to accomplish that. Cindy had a very effective Tree Montgomery public meeting where they came, and I think we were capped at 25 people. I think we actually had more. So we could potentially work with outside organizations to do that kind of tree education. We could also establish some parameters for how many newsletter articles, how many forums, do we do an annual forum on trees? Do we do some newsletter articles? Again, there's tons of information out there that potentially a communication person or someone else could pull together and provide. I just want to caution realistically, as Peter well pointed out, where a lot of single person expertise is. Yep. And so currently the way the ordinance is written and the requirements and the number of applications that we get on a monthly basis is a full-time job.
So then that raises an added question. So then if you look at the definition that's in there for the duties, even if we don't include as a direct or sole responsibility the education outreach, it does say prepare an annual report including all the number of applications that were received, the number of permits, all of that. That strikes me as really valuable information, but is even being able to do that
yeah, well, we handle
excessive?
that administratively, so yeah, we have all that information. I mean, currently, we're still very low-tech, but eventually we're going to get it in a more online format, and then those types of reports in terms of number of applications, number of permits, number of this, number of that. It should be less time-consuming to develop that information. But we've got that managed administratively now within the department, so we've produced any number of reports, going back 5 and more years about those aspects.
The second thing on this list of duties is the master plan of the inventory of trees on public space. And that was something that you and I talked about, how, so on the one hand, we have a tree canopy assessment for the University of Vermont that says that the action is on private property. On the other hand, the thing that's the easiest is to look at the space that we own now, and how can we streamline that process so it doesn't take so much time? How do we, and then would we have time for the actual inventory of what we've got and what we don't have?
Sure.
Because right now it says do an inventory, but we know that's not realistic given the workload.
I mean, Jan can probably speak to this as well. My own personal opinion is that the LiDAR analysis provides very useful information for the city to have to track historically over time.
Okay.
Our general canopy citywide, which I think is of critical importance to the city. We could have a robust right-of-way planting program and no trees, or very few trees on private property, and we would be losing the battle. So I think that LiDAR analysis is really a critical piece, and it is a fairly inexpensive thing for us to do because we're blessed with a number of resources right in our midst. Montgomery County does the LiDAR analysis. We use their data. So if we were to try to do LiDAR ourselves, it would be prohibitively expensive. But we're able to use the data that they're already collecting and work with groups like the University of Mont that can take that data and do the analysis for us. I think the last time was $5,000. We understand through the county that they're planning to do LiDAR polls every 6 years, and then an analysis every 3 years. The next LiDAR poll they're planning to do is in 2021. And so I think we should probably align our cycle with what the county has said they're going to do, or at least make reference to it, that we'll track the county's LiDAR evaluations and have one done for the city every time LiDAR data becomes available. I think it's, given what we've seen this past year, having it done every 3 years is going to be an informative process. In the past, I think we would have said, 5 years, 6 years, nothing's going to change that much. But I think my perception changed as of the result of what we went through last year. So I think a 3-year analysis would provide a very good kind of touch point along the way and keep our information pretty relevant. Now getting to the issue of inventory. You know, an inventory is where you go by and determine species, size, location, you geolocate it. It's a more cost-intensive and time-intensive process. It also requires constant updates, or the data itself becomes out of date and inaccurate. So when you do an inventory, you also have to have a process for updating it. And again, if we were to do that, I think what we're looking at is the right-of-way, which is again a fairly narrow piece of our overall space available for canopy. So I think we just need to have a conversation as to whether or not the cost warrants the value of that, and whether or not that will help us move forward. Will it be helpful to have an inventory of our right-of-way trees in order for us to grow our program, continue our work? There is some benefit of being a city of our size, which, you know, Jan probably drives the city almost every street over the course of a month. So we have a lot of feet on the ground and eyes on the ground, and he's very aware of what's taking place, versus if you were overseeing a county or a larger area where there are parts that you would never get to unless you had to. So I'm of mixed minds about the value of an inventory. In some ways, I'd rather save the money and put it into planting programs and maintenance programs. But if the community and the council feel really strongly that they'd like to have a baseline inventory done, we have had them done in the past. I can't remember the date of the last one, but it was
You looked it up when
fairly
I was
old.
talking to you, and it was so old it wasn't
Yeah.
worth discussing, as I recall.
But is that
It was
different
almost
from?
20 years old.
I'm sorry, is that different from the 5-year LiDAR?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it's a
It
very
was-
specific species and diameter and tree condition rating of each tree that's located in the right-of-way. And these days with technology, you would literally make a geolocated map of trees. I mean, there's some fascinating things that communities are doing where, you know, you can kind of online take a walk through trees and see pictures and find out history about trees and find out where the largest of whatever species is. But again, if we're looking at just our right-of-way, we're not going to have that broad of a information pool to provide.
While we're on the role of the urban forest manager and street trees, what is the current process for doing, for doing street tree plantings, for selecting the site and selecting the trees and the whole business? And is there any way that that could be streamlined? Again, thinking about where the best use of time is.
I'll let Jan speak to how he selects the planting.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So, in part, it's resident-driven. So, if I get requests for, you know, by residents, one example of that was Cedar Avenue this last spring. Sorry. So the other way is if trees are removed, you know, to replant in in a nearby location. So
Is that automatic, that if a tree's removed, you've
so
got it marked to eventually be
Yeah,
replanted?
exactly, yeah. So that's one of the things that I'm working on right now for the spring tree planting. So the other way is just as I drive through the city and I see planting locations, and then the other location is city parks. So I just met with the with a colleague who manages the parks to look at tree planting in parks as well. So currently for this this spring, I'm looking to plant trees in Colby Avenue, Erskine, Grand Avenue, and then also Glenside. And then there's 5 city parks also, and then also Larts Avenue as well. So,
That's
and then
a lot
basic.
of planting for one season.
Excuse me?
That's a lot of planting for one season.
Yeah. Well, spring is really the best time to plant also.
I'm not complaining, I'm just
Yeah.
noting.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work right there, and then with
It
each,
is.
with each
Can we, I'm
lot.
sorry, just, I want to, could we stay focused on the ordinance? I mean, I'm asking is like relating back to the
Well,
ordinance.
yeah, because
is
in,
it-
in this long list of
Okay.
things, it says there's gonna be a street tree inventory.
Right.
Which doesn't seem really very realistic.
One advantage
Right,
of
no, I'm just, okay.
one advantage of doing a street tree inventory is that they can include also potential planting locations. That would be one benefit, but that's really, as Daryl mentioned, there's, you know, it's important to look at what's the best way to move forward.
Well, the inventory could be important if we're focused on some of the equity questions that have arisen about parts of the city that are under-treated, if that's a word. One way of helping to address that would be to understand, are there, through an inventory like this, street areas that would be capable of forming an initial expansion of planning in some of the under-treated areas. So in that sense, it seems like it fits in with that component.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
One of the
But
key,
if-
one
but-
of the key criteria also or benefits of an inventory is that you can identify the diversity of the tree species in an area. And that, especially as we're dealing with climate change or whatever, may end up becoming more important. To me, you know, we're not at the place yet, but at some point, if we're able to get that kind of inventory on private property, that, as Ms. Braithwaite mentioned, that's where the bulk of our trees are, and that's particularly useful information.
Taking it back to the ordinance a little bit, my question is how much of this really belongs in the ordinance versus our
The
resolution or some
right.
other place? Because it seems to me, especially with the inventory question, that doesn't seem like something that needs to be in the ordinance. And some of these other urban forest manager role, maybe we need something general about what that role is, but it doesn't seem like all of that needs to be in the ordinance versus some other place.
You know, for
Yeah,
other,
that's
for
what I was
other
wondering.
areas, we don't define somebody's position as this detailed in the ordinance.
Mhm.
So it may be more about what your expectation is in terms of reporting out or that kind of thing, as opposed to tying it to a particular position.
But I think it can be useful if there's a misunderstanding in the community at large that Jan is able to provide individualized arborist type detailed advice as opposed to commenting on tree protection plans or doing assessments. Some paragraph like this can at least put out there, look, this is his job. And if you have a detailed arborist question, you have to hire an arborist. Maybe in the past, our city people could do that, but those days seem to have gone, right?
I think a tree implementation plan, you know, there's the tree canopy goal and then also an implementation plan, and I think that would be a great place also to specify these kinds of things as well. You know, LiDAR, when, and, you know, if you were to do a tree inventory, then it's the same.
Great. So some of those things maybe we can return to discuss during the resolution discussion, and we can see what fits in where. But this is a good list of things for us to talk with the city attorney about and see about drafting something that's maybe condensed a little bit but contains these elements.
I think we're going to clarify, any reporting is annual, not quarterly.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was the next thing on the list here, yeah.
No, that's-
All right.
Before we turn away from the ordinance, can I ask or
Yeah,
we-
we're still going to talk about the replanting requirements.
Okay, before we
Mhm.
do that, on the list of potential changes, the first list, the ones we talked about already, there was just one that I didn't remember this exactly what we were thinking. And while Jan is here, I wanted to ask him. So the requirement the residents who replant themselves document that. The question I have is, has that actually been a problem? Because most people pay the fee. So what's the thinking there?
I think it is important to check to make sure that people have planted. And I think a simple way is just by people sending a picture
Okay.
within the 6-month time frame, and to follow up. And then, yeah, I think that is helpful to make sure that it's that trees have been planted.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's move then to our discussion of the criteria for removing trees, which I know there are a few questions regarding. And then, in addition to that, sort of related to it, the chart which is used for assessing the health or sort of level of the tree, and the replanting requirements, which are up on the screen here. So starting with the criteria, this is in section 1212-080A. There are a number of criteria that I believe the city attorney rewrote. What he said to us was that he rewrote them and moved them into a new section, but the overall content is more or less similar to what had been previously there. And those are, it says the tree commission may approve the permit, disapprove the permit, or approve the permit with modifications and/or conditions. And this is also for the city manager and the tree commission. So the criteria are the general health condition of the tree, the desirability of preserving the tree by reason of its age, size, or other outstanding quality, the impact of the reduction in tree cover on the property where the tree is located, adjacent properties and the surrounding neighborhood, and the extent to which said areas would be further subject to environmental degradation, the location of the tree in relation to targets, any compelling reason for the removal that the applicant has demonstrated, and whether a reasonable alternative to removal of the tree exists, and the extent to which tree clearing is necessary to achieve the proposed development or land use. So
There were 10, and now there's 6. And so what got dropped or merged?
Just taking a look at the old.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it too.
Yeah. So I'm just looking at section 1212-120, the current, the existing code. So we combined a number of criteria and then also eliminated. So in section B, it has the 9 criteria.
I'm sorry, section,
Yeah.
current section.
1212-120.
120, thank you.
And then section B.
I have it.
And this is of the existing or
Existing.
That's the existing.
Okay.
Yeah. So then the first criterion is in F. That's then section 1212-080A1F. So then
So-
let me see, have to.
So 2 is the number and type of replacement trees, which is sort of redundant with the tree chart.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we don't need that anymore. Got it.
So the hardship, the second one is the hardship. Let me see.
And again, I think, I don't know if I agree with it, but theoretically, that's built into the tree chart that we're about to talk about? No.
The hardship issue, I believe, is covered under E, any compelling reasons for the removal that the applicant has demonstrated.
Thank you.
Right, so the key part is there that if there's a reasonable alternative. So if there's and that's typically what in the permit decision process, is there, and this is particularly related to construction, is there a reasonable alternative to, for the applicant to achieve their construction objectives while at the same time preserving the tree. And if there, and that's kind of goes to the hardship clause. If there is a reasonable alternative, then the tree typically does not need to be removed. But basically, a couple of these were combined, and then some were the language. Going through the appeal hearing process, some were just, I think, redundant, and so.
So number 5 and number 8 on the old list also seem to have disappeared or been merged.
So section or item B, the desirability of preserving the tree by reason of its age. I think species should be added there. That's one thing that we discussed, so that age, size, or outstanding quality. So we kind of incorporated that in B.
Could I ask a question? So, Jan, maybe you can answer this. On the new E, where it says any compelling reasons, and then you have the added language about the reasonable alternative, what's the distinction between hardship and compelling reasons? So, I mean, I think most of us would say if there's a genuine hardship, we would want that taken into account. How do you judge if something's a compelling reason? I really want to build my addition. Okay, if you can't do it, is that a hardship? So what makes you feel like, I'm not questioning, I'm not saying it's wrong, but what makes you feel like a compelling reason is the language as opposed to a hardship? I'm just, that's one where I kind of wonder.
I think that was also in consultation with Ken. I think hardship, and I don't know if you can weigh in on that, Skip. So I think hardship is not so easy to define. So, and that goes to your point then, how do you define the compelling reason? So I think the key point is if there's a reasonable alternative.
Mhm.
So, and I would work with the applicant and to kind of, and this is, as I said, this is related to construction projects.
So 2 other things I would say. I don't think I have a strong feeling about compelling versus hardship. I just would kind of like to understand the difference. In C, the new C that you have there, it picks up some of the language that was there before. It says the extent to which the area would be further subject to environmental degradation.
Right.
I'm not sure about the word further. Before, it just says subject to environmental degradation. The removal of any tree doesn't necessarily constitute environmental degradation, so I'm not sure we should say further. That's a small point, but unless there's something else that's capturing there that I'm missing.
Right, no, I think that could be taken out.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the only other thing that I thought was a bit of an omission to me, or not a bit, a significant omission to me, in new D, where it says the location of the tree in relation to targets. I've said previously, and I don't know if my colleagues agree with me on this or not, but in this section with these criteria, I think it's important to have something about safety, and it just seems as if sort of an oblique reference to targets doesn't zero in on that as much as I think should be there. I mean, we're talking about, in some cases, one of the reasons is if a tree, through its hazardous nature or imminent falling threat, is a genuine threat to safety, to life or property. And if we take that into account anyway, which I believe Ms. Braithwaite said we do, we ought to say it explicitly, because this is the list of criteria that the typical resident is going to look at, so they can understand what the criteria are. So I would encourage us to, in some explicit way, include safety in there.
Yeah, we kind of discussed it at length. So in the definitions, we included the definition of target, which is defined as means people or property that may be subject to injury or damage as a result of the tree's failure. And I think particularly since this issue has come up a lot, so it was decided to use it, use the word targets. I think, the other thing is this is the form, the tree risk assessment that the rating sheet is now based on. And a key part is the health of the tree, but the other side of that coin is the risk assessment. So that's always, taken into account. But your point is basically make it more explicit in this.
If target refers back to safety, let's just put it there. That's what
Okay,
I would say.
Sure, yeah.
So the location of the tree in relation to targets, meaning property, personal, whatever you just read, property, personal, safety.
Yeah, yeah.
Mayor Stewart, did you have anything on this section?
So, and maybe, Jan, the form that you just lifted up might answer some of my questions, but my concern is, and I don't necessarily have answers to this, is, as Councilmember Kovar just said, like, pointing out, like, any compelling reason. I can tell you in the last 5 years, people who complain about and want to take down their tree thinks it's a compelling reason. And so, like, my concern is that this list is still kind of subjective, and so making sure that the ordinance is clear for people about how objective we can get to, because I mean, what happens now is we go through this process and someone might not get denied, and then they email one of us, or they call very, very upset, and much of it has to do with a misunderstanding of how things are being judged and decided what is compelling and what is not. So I don't have answers for this, and maybe this is because dumps in the lap of the city attorney, but I think my intent as we've been going through this whole process over the last 2 years is to make this ordinance objective. Jan, it's not you, it's not the next urban forest manager. The way we are putting this ordinance in place is the same no matter who we have in the position, or if we have a consultant there, and that if the city manager is making decisions, it is clear how the decision is made. Doesn't mean everyone's always going to be happy and people can still argue about it, but right now, there's too much subjectivity at play, and I think it causes a lot of frustration and anxiety and feeling like our ordinance is sort of just really confusing and hard for people to live with. So
I think the first thing with the rating sheet, which it really covers the health of the tree, that's why the changes that were made were based on industry standards, so that it's clear these are the criteria that we use. I think that was an important change to make it more transparent, make it more clear and objective.
And that goes to point A.
Excuse me?
And that goes to point A on the list?
Well, that's the rating
Or A and
sheet,
B.
the actual health of the tree. So that's not. So there's there's two distinct things. So the rating sheet is for the replanting requirement, and that goes to the health of the tree. And then these are all the criteria that are used for determining, if a permit gets approved or denied.
But right now in the ordinance, it just says the general health and condition of the tree. So
Right.
if I'm looking at this and saying, oh, I'm going to go request a tree removal permit, I don't know what standards are being used to decide the general health of the tree.
Sure.
And if it's just the city manager saying, oh, it's healthy, it's not healthy, like that, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think
No
we
offense to the
right, no,
city.
but I don't think the city manager wants to be in this position either. I think we just need to be clear if we are looking towards certain standards and how we communicate that with
Sure,
folks.
no, I think
And again, some of this can be in the ordinance, some can be in admin regs.
Right.
So.
Yeah, so I think it's from that perspective, it would be good to clarify, how is it the health of a tree determined?
Yeah.
And that goes back in part to the, to the sheet that I just mentioned, the form, and then the rating sheet, because that's much more in line now with, I think, than it previously was, so.
Great.
Well, could you say the general health of the tree pursuant to
As
the
determined by the
rating
rating
sheet or something like
Yeah,
that?
exactly.
Not slavishly following, but using that as a guide, because then
Exactly,
the average
yeah.
person would say, oh, it's,
And
my
then-
health is based on this. Now, that hardship is a separate question. but-
Right.
And then that the rating sheet is based on what's a form that's used in the industry standard.
But I think you can't just refer to the rating sheet. You have to say that it's at this level on the rating sheet. Or, I think that's, we may, that part may be in the admin regs
Right.
because these things change. But I want somebody to say, oh, okay, it's a 7, so it, I don't have the slightest idea. But so it qualifies or it doesn't qualify on that criteria. And then you realize you still have to look at these other aspects, but at least you see where you are on the list.
Yeah, the challenge to me is that I feel like the general health and condition of the tree is very objectively defined and clear in terms of having a chart and having a rating, and it's really easy to look at that and see. But all of the other ones are very, as the mayor said, subjective. Like there's no way to define whether your tree does or doesn't fall into those with a numerical value. And I don't know, maybe there isn't a way to do that, but providing some context, I think, would be helpful.
Right. I think it's not so easy, but I think particularly the other thing is that you have the tree removal and just strictly for removal of the tree, and then also related to construction, and those are they're combined in one set of categories. So one option might be, I don't know if it's feasible to create two categories, one that applies for so that
Well, I think I would just say, it's art as well as science here, too. We're not going to be able to completely draw objective lines around the whole thing, right? So.
I think the other thing is, the person in the urban forest manager position is also, qualified, has a certain level of expertise.
Right.
That's, through the hiring process. And the other thing, but the issue that was raised earlier, I tend to also touch base with, if other arborists have looked at a tree, I tend to call them. I typically ask residents, who has looked at your tree, that, I touch base with them to make sure. This is, from my perspective, a really important process, and safety is really key. So I take that really serious and really make sure that I'm thorough in that process. That it is really hard to, I think, be really clear and that there's no ambiguity in the process. But I think that's why it's important to have a professional that looks at the tree and evaluates it. And I think there's definitely some possibility to clarify some things, but I think it's also to really, to some people that are not arborists, it may not be always so clear too. That I think that, I'm not sure if that can be avoided, but I think it's important to strive to make it as clear as possible, obviously.
The other thing about the criteria, those things that seem a little bit subjective, such as B, that also can be part of a discussion if you're appealing something or you're arguing about something, and somebody can say, yeah, but this is 120 years old, so it helps to identify the subject matter that you'll talk about in those discussions, even if there's not a strict line.
I think
Great.
also with the, as we're moving to a process that's a digital process, I think people will be able to see the rating chart And then also, if a permit is denied, I'll indicate the reasons as to why the permit was denied using the criteria that we will that we have currently, and then if they're revised, the revised ones, so that people understand clearly. So I think that will also go a long way in helping people to understand as to why a permit was denied. I think if a permit is approved, then that's not a non-issue, because that's why people applied. But particularly in cases when a tree removal permit is denied, that people understand clearly, I think that will go a long way.
Mhm. So the other thing we should talk about, if anyone has questions about, is the chart that we were referring to, which is in section 1212-100, 1212-100C. And this is the chart that was modified to be more in accordance with industry standards. And that involved, Jan, maybe you can walk us through some of the changes here, but that involved removing the aspect for life expectancy due to that being difficult to define, I think was what you said was the reason.
Yeah.
And then some of the other things being a little more standardized in terms of how they're looked at.
Yeah. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah.
Can
yeah,
I
24.
make a request that the risk assessment and the tree, the sheet you just showed, that's I think new-ish for rating trees, and then on the back the side the risk assessment, what you're using now, I would appreciate to see a copy, because it might help me to better understand how the criteria and the rating chart and the replacement requirements all line up with what you're actually doing in the field right now. That would help me, I think.
Okay, sure. Okay.
And the same thing on the rating, because this is the replanting requirements on the screen, but it's not the rating chart.
Yeah, what's this?
Where, is that the one that, is the new rating chart that Casey just referred to, is that in the
Yeah, it's
draft
page,
ordinance?
page
That's the new
24
one,
and
not the old
25.
one? Okay.
Yeah. So currently,
newish new
we
one.
have, it starts with the trunk of the tree, and I just wanted to start at the bottom. The root and the root collar are really important.
We're on page 24 of the newly
of
revised
the new
ordinance?
version. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so, as I said, this is, I use this document, and I don't know, there's different categories on this sheet, and it starts with here with the root and the root collar. So that's the first item that we put in the chart. Then the trunk.
I'm sorry, it's starting on page 26 of the group that you had, the actual 25 and 26 of the actual package that you'd primarily been using.
Yeah, it depends on which one you're looking at. It's section 1212-100. Mhm.
Yeah, I'm looking at the February work session version. Sure. Yeah. So the first is the roots and the root collar, and then with the different values, 5 through 1, 1 through 5. I think that's it's part of the tree risk assessment form, but that's the first thing I typically look at. Are the roots healthy? Is the root collar healthy? And then if there's some decay or if there's significant decay, the next step would be to look at the trunk of the tree, see if it's sound and solid, and then the different, if it's less healthy, it goes to the rating of 3 or 2. I typically use some tools, a rubber mallet, metal rod, to kind of check both the roots and the root collar and the trunk. Then, the next part of the tree is the crown and the branches. Again, there's is it healthy? Is it full? Is it balanced? Or is it unbalanced, and so forth? So that's rated. And there's the different ratings. For the next section is the tree health and species profile. And that's, different species. Some species may be more prone to failure, so I think that's important. The tree health, part of that is also the foliage, which is not included in the crown and the branches. The crown and the branches is just really the structure of the tree. So the tree health that covers the foliage, the vigor, and then so life expectancy. There was a lot of discussions about that with the tree commission and with the city attorney. And I think the sense was that was too subjective. Daryl and I proposed to, to have a short, intermediate, long-term rating for that possibly, but I think the idea was in general that it was still quite subjective, so decided to go with proposing four criteria.
And
So can I ask, go ahead.
I was just going to ask quickly, the growth rate was also removed from the chart as well? Was that integrated into one of the other sections?
Yeah, so the growth rate is in the tree health and the species profile, and then also in the crown and the branches. So growth rate is also, I think it's not so easy to measure. So that's another reason why that was eliminated. It's particularly for larger trees, it's not easy to measure the growth rate.
So a couple 3 months ago, maybe longer, the Tree Commission had a subcommittee that developed a revision to the chart that is in the current regulations. And is this a revision then of that proposal, or is this essentially the same? Because I thought that had more than 4.
No, this is a revision of that.
Okay, so this is another.
Correct.
And this is essentially what you're doing now, is what I hear you saying, which is fine. I'm just trying to clarify.
Well, no, I followed the
old one.
So the rating sheet that is in the current code is what is being used.
Okay,
So that's
thank you.
Yeah.
So could I just get a couple of clarifications? So for the new rating chart, there's only 4 categories, and the maximum point total is 5, so the maximum total would be 20, right? And the lowest would be 4. So that makes sense. And so then within that, so if you score between 4 and 9, and it's an undesirable tree or damaging a structure, it's still, you're saying there will be a 1-for-1 replacement? Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, can I speak to that? We, in the previous iteration of this, we had the understanding that part of the council's interest was to, again, in that effort to remove the word waiver and move everything to permits, also to clarify the replanting requirement when it was in effect and when not. So we already do not require replanting for dead trees or hazardous trees. It was our understanding that the council was interested in adding in trees in decline to not be in the replanting criteria. So that's what this is a goal at getting. Those trees that are in the lower rating, 9 and below in the new chart, below 6 in the old chart, would not have a replanting requirement. As we were evaluating this and talking to the Tree Commission and just amongst ourselves, understanding that the council is trying to weigh this balance of reducing the replanting requirement because of the burden that places on people, but also has a tandem goal of trying to maintain and enhance our canopy, that these things kind of weigh in the balance of each other. And so one of the suggestions that we had was, rather than have no replanting, was to require just 1 tree replanting across the board. Council can decide not to do that. This is just a proposal. So if you want to keep with no replanting, it would be anything, from 9 and below would have no replanting. It was our concern that as we adjusted the ordinance to provide less punitive and costly measures for replanting, we may also be accelerating our loss of canopy. So we wanted to try to balance that out. And so it's our opinion that requiring one tree to be replanted anytime somebody is removing a tree, whether it's dead, hazardous, or in decline, is not so much a hardship, particularly if we can connect people to our bulk buy program, and it's literally something they can do very easily and get a tree planted. And in most cases, since you're removing a tree, you have the ability and the space in your yard to have a tree. Now, the council may decide it doesn't want to do that. We just put it out there as a way to try to keep these issues in balance as we try to reduce the hardship on people.
I appreciate that. If I'm understanding you correctly, and it's a complex area, but I think my sense would be to not require it in some of those situations, but to not have that mean that therefore we're not working to maintain and or expand the canopy, but just that would be separate, possibly bigger initiative that we would undertake based on some of the guidelines in the resolution that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet, so that I don't think the number of trees in really bad shape or hazardous that are going to fall down pretty soon anyway, if a few more of those get approved to be cut down without a replacement, but that meanwhile we take some vigorous steps, admittedly depending on the budget and other factors, to really work on promoting and expanding the canopy. To me, that would balance out in a fair and appropriate way. And again, I don't know if my colleagues would agree with that, but I'd be inclined to not have that lowest category have a requirement for a replacement, as long as we pair it up with a very vigorous, broader canopy program. That's just where I am.
Understand that. I just know that for us, it's the one time we have a link with somebody. They need a permit. We can encourage them or require them to plant a tree. Otherwise, we're speaking to people, hidden masses, right? We're just trying to incentivize and encourage people to plant trees. But when we're in a relationship issuing a permit, we have an ability to connect with people in a way that might motivate more trees.
I think people might be more open to participating in a broader canopy effort if they didn't feel like they were being sort of hit, right? When they feel like, come on, this thing's just got to come down, and it's going to come down. It's not really contributing in any significant way to carbon
And I think that
sequestration
kind
and
of
so on.
goes back to the legislative findings and the goal of the program. I mean, it sort of depends on, there's many, many ways to get to enhanced canopy. And in my own opinion, the more ways we're working on it, the better. This is just one avenue, but it's really council decision on that.
So on that one too, having taken down a tree this year, I think it's so expensive when a tree is in decline or dead to take down. And the other thing is that lots of times you don't take the stump out because it's additionally expensive. So the idea that there's room isn't always, because that's additional expense. However, I'm going to then say, I do appreciate the direction that you all were going in with this. And I wonder if, as you say, this is a point of connection with folks, if instead of just doing the permit for removal, that we also provide information, because I don't think we do that now. At least I remember just getting the permit to remove, but not getting the additional information as hey, you can do this, do the bulk buy, or if we do this, donate to the tree fund or something else. So not to make it a requirement, but kind of do a heavy sell on things that they could do to replace the tree. Might be a way to go, because I just think, again, thinking of the state of mind somebody's in when they have to take down a tree that is either dead or decline, and the cost of that. So
I have a similar opinion. I do not support a one-for-one replacement with trees that are dead or hazardous, because you're already just paying so much to remove them at that time. And I like the idea of having, at that moment of direct contact, having more information for them. I'm not sure financially if it would be, what the impact would be, but I wonder if it would actually be possible to sort of do the opposite and provide some sort of incentive where, like, for a year after you take down a dead tree, you'll receive an additional discount on a bulk buy purchase through the city or something like that.
Sure, well, the bulk buy tree at this point is
Which is pretty cheap.
incredibly good deal. $200 for a tree where someone digs the hole, plants it, and guarantees it's gonna live for 1 year. You can't get that anywhere else, so it is a bargain deal. It's, you're not gonna find a better deal
No,
than
and I
that.
think just giving some of that information out might really be helpful.
Yes, we've been discussing having more bulk buy than spring and fall, so
Yeah.
it's, yeah, I think that could be an automatic part where we just send a flyer about the bulk buy with the permit.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. I don't know, I'm projecting my own personal behavior here. So,
Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of, and I understand it's already cheap, I'm just thinking in terms of the incentivizing, like if you already spent all this money to take down a tree and you're thinking, oh, for 1 year, I have an opportunity to purchase this at an additional discount. I mean, maybe it's only $25 or $100 different. And that's probably not a lot in the scheme of like the $5,000 you had to spend to remove your previous tree, but it might be enough to get people to think, oh, I should take action now, instead of just thinking, oh, that's a cool program. Maybe someday I'll take action. Like if there's some way to just encourage that action taking when people are already kind of interacting with the city and planting, to take advantage of that.
Yeah.
Um,
I think this year in particular, doing a bulk buy more than just one quick hit in the spring and one in the fall is really important, because in addition to the people who are taking down the trees, at least in Ward 2, there's all their neighbors who know that the trees are coming down, and those folks have expressed interest in what can we do this spring, what can we do this summer, what can we do this fall. So I think there's a real big opportunity to move a lot of trees this year.
Can you also just speak briefly about the percentages and how that works and how you change them? Because I'm not quite sure I understand how the basal area calculation works, and then what led you between the current and the new one to tweak that a little bit.
Sure, well, I think part
If
of it.
that question makes sense.
Yeah, part of it is this reaction to our perception of council's interest in requiring less replanting for trees in decline, and a concern that that was going to impact the amount of trees that were getting planted. So I think my understanding, the Tree Commission's recommendation was to increase the percentage replacement as a reflection and as a result of that. On the staff level, we were pretty comfortable with the percentages that currently exist, and it was our recommendation to keep those percentages. We can show you the chart if you really want to get into the weeds, but we have a chart that has 1%, 2%, 3% graded across with the diameter of the tree. So it's a calculation using math and pi that translates the canopy of a tree based on diameter and then tells you a replacement requirement.
But what's the basal area? What does that consist of? That was what I wasn't sure of.
The basal area is the diameter,
The
everything
cross-section.
everything within the trunk of a tree.
Which is essentially a reflection of how what kind of
Circumference.
tree and how old it is.
So if that's 100 square feet or whatever, you need to plant a tree that has whatever percent it is of that. So it's going to be
It's
obviously
a
much
percentage of that,
smaller
and
tree.
again, that formula was created to replace the existing canopy in 25 years. So that was part of the initial establishment of that percentage. So you take a tree diameter and an assumption about the canopy size, you're going to remove it. If you want to get that same size tree back in 25 years, this is how many trees you'd need to plant to do that.
So that calculation would depend on the size of those replacement trees, because
All
together,
assuming an 1.5-inch diameter tree.
together they equal a percentage, right?
Right.
And then
Okay.
there's the different categories. So if it's a category 4 tree, which is a large canopy tree like an oak or a sycamore, then the replanting requirement would be a similar.
Similar species,
Yeah,
yeah.
similar category.
But are the other replacements always that diameter, or do
Yes,
bigger
our
trees even
language is
exist?
an
or-
1.5-inch caliper. You really, there's difficulty with survivability of trees planted larger and trees
Okay.
planted smaller. Also, survivability is, because of the deer,
So that's
just
like
about
the sweet
impossible.
spot for survival
Yeah.
to actually,
Yeah.
okay.
All of this assumes, and this gets to the resolution, I think, all of this assumes that the burden of replanting the current tree canopy is on the private homeowners. And that's something that I'd like to talk about a little bit more, because as we shift from thinking about individual trees to thinking about the urban forest overall and the tree canopy overall, I think we have to start thinking about the balance of responsibility. So I'm not completely comfortable with going with these higher percentages. Recognizing that means we have to come up with some other way to replace the trees, absolutely. Because if we don't have another community-based way to do it, then we don't maintain our canopy. I completely understand that.
Yes, I think at 5% you will hear from people.
Well, since at 3% we already do.
Mhm.
It's a lot when it's a. And so I saw a tree a couple of days ago that I took a picture, it's like this close to the edge of the porch. And then when it gets bigger, it's gonna be one of these damaging a structure trees. So how would a tree like that fit into this? Because it is currently healthy, and it's not, I don't think it's it's not a white oak, but it's one of the other oaks. It's a very nice tree, but you can just see where it's going.
Sure,
so
the
how does that work?
recommendation is to reduce the replanting requirement in half in cases where it's damaging property.
But
So
you have
there's-
to wait till it's about to damage the this is my question, not
I
the-
think, and it would be the judgment of the arborist, if you can see it's gonna be a large overstory tree and it's a foot away from a structure, and in a matter of time it will be hitting the structure, I think you can make that assumption. But a lot of it will depend on the species and the portion
And the
of the
growth
property
rate
that's
and the-
being
yeah.
impacted.
Okay, so in a couple of places, we didn't want to say life expectancy or imminent hazard, or define that with a like so many months or so many years. And this is the same kind of thing. It's the professional judgment that if it's an oak, it's not going to grow that much. If it's a different kind of tree, it's going to hit that porch really soon, relatively speaking. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Correct,
Mhm.
yes.
Okay.
I'm not really understanding how that would fall into the rating chart here. There's not really a rating for the damaging structure, right? That's just an assessment. That
There
would be
is
made separate
language
from
in the
that?
ordinance that references a tree impacting a structure. We've added language in there, and then the criteria itself, instead of just undesirable, also has.
But it's not part of the health of the tree numerical rating, is that right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right,
but
it is part of that initial 7 points, 6 points, whatever it was. It references proximity and location.
So is it necessary to say damaging or potentially damaging in order to cover the kind of situation you're talking about?
Yeah, I'd be a little bit worried about potential because, a tree could fall and smash my house. That's potential. I think we'd be better off sticking to pretty clear, impacting property. If you've got roots pushing against your foundation wall, that's impacting property. And again, back to Jan's earlier point, there are cases where a tree branch is banging on a roof. Well, that's a situation that could be trimmed and addressed. So if there's not a way to remove the hazard, then it puts itself in a category of a reduced replanting requirement.
So my question with regard to these charts, and I just actually noticed an error I made when I typed them in, the 2.5% for undesirable species in the existing should actually be 1.5%.
Right.
That's an
1.5,
error that I
yeah.
made when I was putting it in. So how do the existing tree ratings compare with the new tree ratings? So for example, something that is currently rating like a 16, what is that likely to rate in the new changed rating system. It's just very hard to compare and consider what the same tree would look like in the two different scenarios.
I'm guessing they're pretty relative, line by line. 6 to 15, it's going to be 4 to 9. Again, because you got 4 criteria and 5 points each,
Okay.
so they'll track pretty well. Again, you can't be absolute because there are certain situations where there could be something seriously structurally wrong with a tree, which would mean that its hazard level was extreme, whereas everything else about it might be okay. So you do have a little bit of, the professional expertise of the arborist in that evaluation. But I think it's pretty safe to say those lines are comparable across.
And then my other question is, in terms of the replacement in 25 years, and that being how this is determined, that takes into consideration the size of the tree, but not necessarily the existing health of the tree. Is that right? So,
well, it does in that percentage replacement. So a tree in
Right.
poor health has a smaller percentage of replacement than a tree in good health.
So in theory,
the
if-
health of the tree is reflected in that percentage.
So if, for example, a large number of white oaks, for example, are dying or are, let's say, aren't dead, but like end up in this 10 to 16 range versus smaller trees, that would impact basically how much gets replanted. I guess that probably, it doesn't happen that often. I don't know if that makes sense.
I thought if a tree was dead, it would
That's
not-
why I'm saying, yeah, it wouldn't be a dead tree. It would be
Well, that's a good question.
like people start removing significantly larger trees versus removing smaller trees. How does that impact our replacement of the canopy? I'm just trying to figure out, like, looking at this, at the two charts, it's like, I really don't have a good sense at all of how changing from what we're doing right now in terms of the percentages to what's being proposed here, how many new trees that translates into and what the impact is on the canopy. Is there any way to say, like, what is the impact on the canopy if we keep what we have now, or if we go with the proposed, or we go somewhere in between?
Well, so first of all, with the proposed rating, 4 to 9 goes also to the point to simplify the process. 4 to 9 would be an automatic approval with, no replanting requirement or one replanting requirement, however the council wants to move forward. So that's really clear. And, now trees that equates to a tree being in poor condition. So 10 to 16 is a tree in fair condition. 17 to 20 is a tree with the proposed rating in good condition. Now, typically, trees in fair condition or in good condition cannot be removed unless there's a compelling reason. For example, it's adjacent to a structure and impacting the structure, or there might be a sewer line that needs to be replaced. There's no other way to do it than to remove a tree. So there needs to be a compelling reason for those two. So the 4 to 9 rating is most of the time. When a tree gets removed, that's the rating of a tree. The 10 to 16 and 17 to 20 is a lot less likely. The other reason why, for example, 17 to 20 or 10 to 16 may happen is related to construction, and that goes back kind of to the hardship clause, or to a person, if they want to develop and a tree needs to be removed, then in some cases, if there's no other way, a tree may need to be removed. So then there is a replanting requirement.
So for this past year, or for the first 6 months of this past year, is there some easy way for you to tally, there were so many permits and they were in which categories? Like, most of them were in this, I guess we're working off of 6 to 15. Most of them were 6 to 15, and 20 of them were 16 to 24, and 5 of them were 25 to 30, or whatever it is.
We don't log the rating on the.
Pardon?
We don't log the rating on our database. We do log the replanting and the size of the tree. So it wouldn't be an easy thing to pull out what the ratings were of the trees that we evaluated last year.
But, okay, but if what I was actually thinking about was the replanting requirements, then you've got that, and we could
Yeah,
see
we
what
have
that
that,
looks
and
like.
I think I've provided that information.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
If
would
I
you
haven't, I
say
missed
that
it.
would you say, though, that the 25 to 30 category, which is the current rating chart, that's a small percentage of the
A
total
very
number
small
of permits that are
Yeah,
granted?
usually they're gonna be
Right.
denials. Yeah.
Right, because unless there's a true
ballot
hardship or something, or a sewer or whatever.
Yeah.
But so, in a big tree, 100-year-old, real shade-type tree like an oak or something, that scores in the 25 to 30, under the current scheme, I think Casey said it should be 1.5 instead of 2.5. What's the, typically how many small replacement trees does that end up
Did you bring
being?
that
Is it-
chart?
Can you sort of say that?
We have the chart. We could tell you by size what that is.
Because, I mean, I'm just wondering if there's really not that many per year that are in the 25 to 30 or 17 to 20 category. Maybe the impact isn't that significant.
This is the,
Sure. For instance, if you're looking at a 24-inch tree at 3%, that would be 8 trees. Am I on the right line?
Right.
Yeah, 8 tree replacements. At 2%, it would be 6 trees replacement. At 1%, it would be 3 trees replacement.
So if there's a very small percentage of such cases that get approved, I mean, 10 or 20, or fewer than that, do you think, if you had to guess?
Of
This-
trees with a high rating?
I would say out of the number of permits that were approved, it's, I would say 90+% is in the 6 to 15 rating, the poor rating. And I would say it's a very small percentage of trees in fair and good condition, particularly in good condition, but also in fair condition.
So, I mean, we can try to figure that out, but I think I'd be inclined to say, keep the percentages where they are, and just find a way of building into our broader canopy work a sufficient level to more than compensate for whatever the drop-off would be. That would be my view.
And then, if it's I'm sorry, go ahead. If it's based on basal area, then the really big trees get higher replacement numbers. And if they're, under the current scheme, if they're dead, they're dead. But under the current scheme, if there's still some life in them, and they might, like, we haven't made that change in the ordinance to, imminently hazard. So maybe what we're hearing about is the people who are right in that area of the very big trees that aren't quite dead yet, and that's a very high number of replacement trees.
I think that's
But it's a
the-
very, except for the last few months with the oak die-off, it's not actually a lot of individual trees.
Yeah, so I think that's the key change. So currently, a waiver is issued when a tree is dead or hazardous. And then the gray area, I think, for some people is the trees that are not hazardous but are enough in decline that, will all approve the removal, and there's the replanting requirement. And I think what is proposed is that, that grayness is taken away. And so 4 to 9 is just any tree in that category is, the tree permit is automatically granted. And then, possibly with 1 replant or no replants.
So
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I would say for looking at this, the, whatever we want to call it, the 17 to 20 or the old 25 to 30, I don't know, 5% does seem maybe pretty high. I'm fine having that sort of be a high number, because what I'm hearing from you all is that those are like really healthy trees. And if somebody is taking down a really healthy tree, I think we should get as much as we possibly can to replace our canopy. So for me, I look to you all for your advice and the tree commission. Maybe the 2.5 and the 5% is a bit high, and we take that down a little bit. but I might be okay with that. It's more the middle category that I might want to stay more closer to what we have now, because I feel like that's a little grayer. It may be a tree in decline. It may be something else. So I like the idea of like if it's a dead tree or like seriously hazard, no replanting, and we do a push on education to highly encourage people to. The middle category, I would go back to what we've had before. The upper category, I would be comfortable really pushing that to, I don't know if the 2.5 and the 5% are appropriate, but pushing that a little bit more, because of that we're talking about very healthy trees.
No, I think the clarification in the code also what's proposed is that again that if a tree is immediately impacting a structure and it's not through pruning or other tree measures, tree pruning, then that the tree would be half the rating. So for example, there's one situation where a tree was in really good condition, was impacting the roof, and it was a large tree, and the replanting was very significant. So that I think that would be then possibly half.
Right.
That's what's proposed.
And that's what we have in the, that's so, yeah. That's why I'm okay with, okay.
So that's sort of where I am in terms of the upper level trees. I think it makes sense to have those be, have a more significant replanting requirement. I don't know exactly what that is. I do think the 5% is pretty high. Looking at the damaging a structure though, I'm wondering, I mean, if something is really damaging a structure, it seems like that needs to come down, not come down and you replant potentially 8 trees. What's a real life situation where that's happening and where it would be damaging a structure but not fall into the category of hazardous, or some of these other categories where you would potentially, I guess, in the new system, you wouldn't receive a waiver. So I guess I'm wondering, if there's a structure that, a tree that is, 24 inches and is damaging your roof, do you have to remove that and then pay for 8 replacement trees? And does that make sense?
So currently, if a tree is impacting a structure, and let's say the tree is in really good health and the rating is 25 to 30, the replanting requirement is according to what's shown on the screen here, that would be 3%. So I think in the new ordinance, what's proposed is to cut that in half. So to make it easier and less burdensome for people that are in that situation. So if a tree is in the proposed rating in the 17 to 20 category, then it would be half the whatever the replanting requirement would normally otherwise be.
So do trees right now, I'm sorry, this is one of those things where when you get into it, you think you understand it, and then all of a sudden you start questioning everything you thought you understood. Yeah. So hazardous trees, if a tree is deemed to be hazardous, somebody's going to get a permit for sure, because we're not going to deny that. Mm-hmm. But what happens, does that in any way impact the replanting requirements? So it could be hazardous, but you still have to pay for the higher level.
No, if you have a hazardous tree, there's no replanting. It's issued a waiver.
A waiver. So in the new system, what happens with hazardous trees under what is proposed?
Under what would be 1 tree.
If we took that out,
then
would
there would be no replanting.
Okay.
So the difference between what's currently proposed and what's existing is that currently a waiver is issued for dead trees and hazardous trees. The category that's currently people don't receive a waiver for is trees that I say yes, based after an inspection, yes, the tree needs to be removed, but it's not hazardous. Right. So the tree is in significant decline. It doesn't pose an immediate hazard, but the tree needs to be, I concur, the tree needs to be removed. So there's a replanting requirement for those trees under the current rating system. So in what's proposed, those trees are also going to be, there's going to be either a 1 tree replacement or no replacement requirement. So that's I think the biggest change.
But wouldn't it be possible for a hazardous tree to rate a 17?
No.
If it were impacting a structure? I guess it wouldn't be considered to be hazardous.
A hazardous tree, we would rate a hazardous tree and.
Hazardous is really bad. Hazardous, you need to get away from the tree.
So it's, yeah.
It's a danger.
Okay.
Yeah, an imminent danger.
The thing I think I'm getting at is I think a lot of people who have a tree that is impacting their property, their roof, their garage, whatever, hanging over their child's bedroom, to them that feels hazardous.
Right.
And so I'm trying to figure out how that fits into the requirements here. But that is, we've talked about that before, and that is something that fits into, you're saying that would fit into the damaging a structure, but not, that doesn't impact their replanting,
Sure.
besides fitting into that category.
Right. And there's, I mean, again, there are people who have a fear about a tree over their house, and the tree is not in any way threatening the house or anything around it. It could be perfectly healthy, but a person's perception can be, they feel threatened. So understanding that that's a real thing, and we certainly hear from people like that, what we try to provide them is there's actual science to evaluating a tree, and try to give them some comfort that you can determine if a tree is in decline or in any way structurally unsound, so that you either have reason to fear or no reason to fear. So that's part of the issue, why
And
we
we
try
do
to clarify it.
do define I mean, I just want to, there is a definition for hazardous. In relation to a tree or tree part means defective, diseased, or dead, and posing an unreasonable risk of failure or fracture with the potential to cause injury to people or damage to property.
Yeah.
So I think that having that definition, then.
Right, but that
yeah.
seems to suggest then that if something is damaging a structure, it would be by definition hazardous. And I thought we just said if it's hazardous, it just gets to be taken down.
Well, if the council wants to, you know,
Okay.
propose
Well,
that any tree
okay.
that's impacting a structure doesn't get replanted, I mean, you
Well, I mean,
can
I-
certainly add that to the.
From my point of view, and again, we've been talking about this for over a year, my conception of what we were going to be doing, and others can disagree, was that making it slightly, injecting a little more flexibility into removing hazardous trees and compensating for that, not by increasing further the replanting requirements for really healthy trees, but compensating for that by adopting a robust overall general plan for more planting and strengthening our canopy. And so to me, if we're able to do that, and I understand there are budgetary constraints there, then we can get the result we want without having to bump up the percentages.
Just, I think though you misspoke, because the issue is not the hazardous trees, it's the ones that are declining or people think might be hazardous, and then they get the replanting requirements. That's who we get the biggest complaints from. If it's hazardous, we handle that part.
Right, but as I understood it, the proposal was to increase the percentage on the second and third category, in part to compensate for the fact that there would be more, or potentially more trees being taken down that wouldn't need replacement. I think that's what the staff said, right? My point is that I'd like to keep that the same and just have a robust planting program, and then we could get the same result.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't sound like the numbers are that high. I don't want to
Well, and
just,
I think I've heard that from several of you, so I think that you certainly can make that change in the chart.
So let's move on to the resolution now, because I think there's
I think
still
we're
a
just
number,
going in
yeah, and there's a
circles.
number of questions on here still. I would like, if you all could take another look at that hazardous versus damaging property, that would be useful to me, because I think it doesn't make sense to me that we would necessarily put a barrier in place if something is genuinely damaging somebody's property.
I just wanted
So-
to make one other point to, I think there's always a certain risk to any tree. I think there's no such thing as an entirely safe tree. When I look at a tree, is it reasonable to assume that a tree is going to fail? So I think, inspections are really important, that people do regular inspections of trees. And I think with that, if people then follow what's recommended, I think, 80 to 90% of tree failure or limb failure can be avoided. But I think that's a really vital part for people to understand the maintenance aspect.
Great. Thank you. So, Councilmember Dabala, can you take us through the resolution? Please.
So the original idea for this resolution was last November, December, in an attempt to capture some of the conversations that we had that were not specifically related to the ordinance about tree canopy, tree goals, native species versus other kinds of species, all those non-ordinance, more programmatic things. That was the genesis of the resolution. So it hopefully captures the sense of the conversation that we all had last fall and winter regarding overarching principles and goals, refocusing more on the urban forest rather than individual trees, stating an overall objective of no net loss, increasing biodiversity and native species and so forth. That whole conversation we had with the Tree Commission, addressing inequities in the different neighborhoods, more active engagement of residents, particularly around protection and maintenance of trees, more focus on private property planning based on what we got out of the tree inventory, tree assessment from the University of Vermont. So the idea was to capture a lot of that before we all get lost in the detail of the ordinance and forget that we ever had these conversations.
I think that is too late.
We missed that.
We passed that
moment.
mark about 2 hours ago.
So that's the spirit in which this is offered. And it also builds on recommendations going back again to last fall and winter from the Tree Commission and the Committee on Environment Subcommittee that there's things we need to address that are not details in the ordinance, and that they had a bunch of ideas about that, about the balance of native versus non-native, increasing the biodiversity, not just, as much as I love white oaks, not having just white oaks. So that's the idea here, and if we go to the resolveds, just walking through them really quickly for everybody. The first one, again, overarching goal of no net loss. It sounds pretty obvious, but it turns out that it hasn't actually ever been said in writing officially. Looking at a more diverse canopy, more native species that are hopefully or maybe climate adapted to future conditions. Second section, laying out some ways in which we'd like to see the policies and programs go from here. The sense that this is part of the responsibility of the entire community, not just whoever happens to own the individual tree that's failing. The important role of the urban forest in climate change, ecosystem services, a broader approach, the inequities, I think I said all this already, more collaboration with residents and so forth. The third section looks at a couple of specifics that we talked about and agreed upon. We can add to this list of specifics that we talk about and agree upon. But last fall, winter, we talked about the LIDAR assessment. Daryl talked about it again tonight, and at that point, every 5 years made sense. So we wanted to capture that. We wanted to capture the direction to staff on the updated species planting list, aligning forest plans with other actions the city is doing. So it's not just trees in a vacuum; it's trees with relation to sustainability, housing, public space. And we talked a lot about a pilot project to.
Is that in there?
Well, that it is, and I don't remember putting it in there.
Because that was one of my, that's my version.
Okay, so I'm looking at the amendments that are suggested by a couple of my colleagues, some of which I agree with, but I didn't want to put them in the draft in the first draft, because it wasn't stuff that we had actually agreed to at the time. We talked about it, but we didn't have everybody sort of shaking their heads yes and hand voting on them. But I think there's a number of areas that we can pretty quickly agree on right now and add to this to give, again, some sense of direction or redirection to the overall program effort. Yes,
So
I'm
I
done, thank you.
Thanks for that's a good description of everything that's in here. And I think the mayor's suggestion looks really interesting and worth including. We can talk about that in a minute. But I think there's one thing that, I helped prepare this draft, but I think there's one thing that maybe doesn't quite capture what we talked about, to me anyway. And so I was one of the people who said, well, let's have that no net loss. But I think to me, what it really should be, as I've thought about it more and looked at it again, and this is in the first resolve clause, is that should be the minimum goal of no net loss. Because I think much of the conversation focused around actually wanting to expand, particularly into the underserved areas. So I don't think we want to say, well, we'll expand into the underserved areas and let the rest of it continue to decline with the infestation we've had with oaks and other kinds of things. So I think, to me, what's missing would be two things, which would be, one, to say something like, now therefore be resolved that the city will adopt a minimum goal of no net loss, and then work into the resolution somewhere something a little bit more explicit on that. We don't just kind of want to increase private property planning, we don't just want to increase underserved areas, but we're looking to really increase the overall tree canopy.
But is that, I thought from a lot of our conversations that honestly, that's not necessarily realistic.
My personal perspective is that keeping the existing canopy
Is gonna be-
is a very ambitious goal.
Yeah.
Right.
Particularly based on, and I think that's why it's helpful to do another analysis in 3 years when the county does their data, because then that's a pretty short time, but then we can actually see how the removal of the oaks.
I guess what I'm saying is, I don't want to close it off, which is why I say that should be our minimum, is preserving what we have.
Right,
So-
but I have a concern if our urban forest manager is saying maintaining what we have is ambitious, writing in, I'm fine saying it's a minimum.
Yeah.
But then saying, and our goal is to
We don't
increase.
we don't have to say
That's-
that, but I just think.
that seems like a lot.
But I think we shouldn't just essentially give up and say, which is why I think the minimum is
Yeah.
important. I'm
That's
okay
fine.
not saying, I'm not saying you have to raise it by a certain
Right.
percentage, but I just want to have on the table that that's not all we're doing, even though it's ambitious to do it.
And I would actually like to add.
We have the ability to do
right,
that.
That's fine, but I would like also, in addition to the amendments I've suggested already, actually add a whereas clause that captures the fact that even maintaining our current tree canopy is an ambitious goal based on the analysis that was done by the University of Vermont this year, because I think it's important that we document that, because we'll lose that, like, the presentation that was done a year ago and that report, as other councils are looking at that, that'll get lost. And then when the LiDAR comes back, or whatever, let's hope it doesn't, but show.
I think
but
the other
losing
thing
all the
is what I mentioned before, is the implementation plan. So one
Yeah.
thing is, a goal and objective, and then how we're going to work towards, and that's, not in the resolution, but that's a vital part, is to come up with an implementation plan and map out, okay, what's the short-term goal, what's the midterm goal, long-term, what steps are we going to take to achieve that goal.
I agree. I didn't want to make the assumption that everybody else, especially you, agreed that that would be a reasonable thing to do and that you have time to do it with the tree commission. So I wanted to talk about that first, but that would be the obvious next step, that and the 3-year reassessment on the LiDAR. To Kate's point, you have a few things in pink, but one of them doesn't seem to be what you just said about the.
No, can I go through my
Yeah.
suggestions? So, no, that was, I just thought of that. given
Okay,
what
so
Councilmember
to
Kolar,
I
if
need to
Councilmember
make a
Kolar
note.
is done, I can run through mine.
Yeah, go.
Okay. No, the one I just added was new, was not a suggestion I had given before, but it just occurred to me, given the suggestion that Councilmember Kovar put forward, and reminding myself, and thank you to our urban forest manager, that even staying where we are is an ambitious goal.
Right, and that could fit
So that
very
could go
nicely
between
in
the
this-
second and to the last and the last whereas classes.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It could go in part of 6 or just before 6 or
Yeah.
something, where we talk about the, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
I've got a note, thank you.
Thanks. And I think one of my first comments is up after maybe the first whereas clause is, I think, to capture, Councilwoman DeBala, what you said before, which is, and you've said tonight, that we've been talking about really rethinking our approach to tree and tree health in the city, and we've been talking about moving more and more of like, that this is a collective responsibility. And not just one that we're gonna say is the responsibility of a homeowner or for trees in the right of way, the city. And I can help with language on that if people agree with that. In the current draft, the 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth whereas clause that says, whereas much of the input received has made it clear that the current focus on permits for individual trees is not broad enough to meet today's urban forest, climate, ecological health, and human safety challenges. I don't know what that, I was confused, I don't.
I think that actually was trying to get at your point
Oh,
that you just
okay.
made,
All
but
right,
in
well,
a very roundabout and not as succinct way. So maybe we can just revise the
But I
wording
think
on
the
that.
point is just doing permits doesn't get at what we want. We need a broader policy.
Okay.
And I think that does dovetail with what you were talking about.
Cool, so we can just clean up the language on that one.
Right.
Then in the second resolve clause, I just had a suggestion for, to start with a bullet that says, trees in the tree canopy are the responsibility of the entire community to protect, nurture, and maintain. Which we just kind of, is a reword, I didn't realize it was a rewording of one lower down, or just move that one up, just to kind of start. Where did I say this? On the, what is currently the second bullet, where we have a broad holistic approach to forest management. I just said, like, this is the first time we're using this term. I'm not sure. I just wanted to highlight that. I'm not sure everybody understands what forest management means, and if that's a term we want to use or define it somewhere. I know this is a resolution, but.
I think I'm ready to crack it.
Okay. And recognition of the trees as a community art, that's, I was saying we could put that up earlier. The 1, 2, 3, the third bullet, it says a focus on addressing inequities in distribution of trees and tree benefits citywide through identifying and prioritizing underserved areas. We've already identified, I'm not sure.
Well,
right?
we've only identified the wards. We haven't identified within the wards.
Oh,
Do we
okay.
want to plant them in the middle of New Hampshire Avenue, or do we want to plant them on Glenside Drive? I mean,
Thanks, okay, that
needs to be-
clarifies, thank you, okay.
Yeah, and then the ward analysis didn't
Yeah,
account
granularize it.
for, right, it didn't granularize by block or by neighborhood. So it included all the parking lots, and
Right, okay,
That's-
cool.
yeah.
No, that's helpful. I guess I was thinking, yeah, the wards, but that clarification is helpful. And then in the fifth bullet, I think it was, on, I just wanted to make this more about collaboration with residents, and just change the language a little bit, so it wasn't just on education. And then, I guess the last one I added was what Councilwoman DeBala said before, was exploring a pilot project to collaborate with members of the community, especially those in areas of lesser tree cover, to develop a plan for community engagement and increasing tree planting care and maintenance that can then be used as a model for other areas of the city. So I'm
I've
posing.
had a couple of volunteer neighborhoods, and I bet you Talisha does too.
Yeah, so just also thinking about, because I think a lot, as we have talked about before, and Councilman Searcy has brought up this point numerous times, is that, you know, if we are gonna be looking at a pretty aggressive tree planting in the future, a lot of this is gonna be on private property, and so really collaborating with people in terms of how that's done, how they maintain the trees, what support they'll need, and things like that.
so I would like to do it, and then the question really is one of staff and prioritizing. and how we free up somebody
Well,
who
I
can
was
do
gonna
that.
suggest that, and this is for the budget conversation, that we look at, this is not something our staff can take on, at all, I see, given our current staffing, and that, this is something that, we would look at whether or not we have enough money in the tree fund now, if that's how we could spend it, or other ways to, have a consultant like Keith Pritchard or someone else assist the city in doing this.
Right, or the woman who did the
I mean, Keith
Tree
Pritchard is
Montgomery
doing something,
workshop,
yeah.
or a couple of the people who live here who do this
Right.
for a living, or,
We could get the mayor to do it.
No, I'm
Or the
not-
mayor.
I'm really not, no. And the reason I just mentioned Keith Pritchard is because he's doing a project like this in DC,
oh, didn't know that. He's expensive.
so.
He's good. He's really good.
Well, obviously, we would go
we-
through a
right, we
request
would
for
have-
proposal
Right,
process.
exactly. I'm not saying, right, exactly. But looking at what he's
Looking at
doing in
how we would do
DC
that,
as a
yes.
potential, and that might not be exactly appropriate.
Does this work for what you were talking about?
Hmm?
Does this cover the kind of thing that you wanted to add earlier?
Yeah, I just have one other question. So I think with these and other changes, I think this works out well for us. The only question is how we can ensure that we don't just pass a resolution with some, good, high-minded kinds of things, but really make it happen, right? So is it just a budgetary thing? Are there other steps we have to take? Do we imagine over the course of the coming year, when we have a lot of other things to do, that we're going to explore, the bullet points in the resolve clause and make some of those things happen? What do we envision that being? Because to me, we don't want to just pass the revised ordinance. We do want to pass a revised ordinance, but we don't want that to be all we do. We want to do these other things, right? So this is a sort of a framework for future action. How do we ensure that we actually do these things? And we don't have to answer that now, but I just want to make sure that it
I'm not
doesn't.
answering that at 10:30.
No, but I just want to underline the point that we need to make sure we follow up on, if we pass a version of this, and actually do some of these things. That's all I'm saying. Because the ordinance will be the ordinance, and when we change it, that'll be the ordinance, and it'll be in effect. If we pass this, none of those things happen unless we take the additional steps. That's all, that's my point. I guess that's obvious in some ways. I just want to urge that we actually do it.
And I guess that's why I added the additional,
Yeah.
the pilot project, because to me, that's a tangible
Great, yeah.
thing we could move towards.
I'd like to hear, maybe not right this minute, a little
Mhm.
more about what Jan and Daryl think would go into some kind of implementation plan or strategy. Or if you think we could, to some degree, jump to an informal identification of blocks and neighborhoods that are short on trees and could be involved in a pilot, one or more could be involved in a pilot project. Again, that's not something you're gonna answer this second, but we can't do both, so I
Yeah, I
like
can just say
going
that
to-
we're, at this point, I don't know how we have any capacity to
Right.
do anything
Anything, right.
beyond what we're currently doing, even to craft an RFP and
And
go
do-
through the process.
Exactly.
I would think that there is certainly things we can do with the bulk buy, because we've got that mechanism underway. I also think the existing neighborhood associations are, and maybe it's not broad enough, but, relying on them to promote, advertise, organize community events, we could potentially connect resources with them if they were to organize a tree walk or,
Well, that's what
bulk
we did
buy
in that one
participation or
neighborhood.
something
Yeah.
like that. I could imagine that, but we're gonna be extremely limited to what else we can do other than what we're currently doing now.
I think one of the things that needs to be revised, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, was the right-of-way plantings. And the pilot project here gets at some of that, I think, redirecting some of those efforts. But I'm also wondering, we've talked about it being a resident-driven program, which is something we've talked about repeatedly as not being equitable. And B, it seems to me that it's not always as effective as it should be. A lot of the trees die. It's a difficult place to plant the trees. The maintenance seems to be an issue with people not watering them. It just seems like that needs to be analyzed in terms of how effective it is and whether there's some alternative shift that if we have limited resources, maybe moving away from the right-of-way planting to a large degree, maybe there's some other place we could better direct our resources.
So one of the things that, I don't want people to forget is that we're working on the public space management plan. And so there's going to be areas where we may want to take up pavement and have more area within the right-of-way that's suitable for planting trees, as well as having better bus stops and a couple other things. So, there's some ways to, I think, we kind of say, well, we're just going to replant exactly where we have before in the 3 feet on those sections where there's some room between the sidewalk and the curb. But we, I think, really have to rethink that for our entire city. And so as we look at a public space management plan, really, where we have an opportunity to not just kind of do a standard, okay, we've got a block and we're just going to go out there and plant them. I think, speaks to your point that sometimes that's not fully successful and there needs to be something that's more successful. And so, and speaking to Ms. Braithwaite's point about our capacity, how we can interrelate these with these other planning processes does do some help, because seriously, both Daryl's and my brain will explode if we think of one more topic. Really, it's just so, you may be hitting us at a bad time to be thinking about that. But in my conversations about the public space management plan, we're really thinking about those kinds of things. The other thing is also not necessarily planting right where something was before. When one of the big oak trees comes down or whatever, if that's a better place for a bus stop and we bump something else out for a good planting place, just thinking about those things so that it's more successful.
And I think the maintenance too. It might be necessary for the city to do more maintenance on those trees to make sure they are staying alive in the drought periods. And I know there are some periods of watering, but it doesn't always seem to be enough if it's a dry summer. So there might be a need to just redirect some resources towards that so we maintain the trees we have before we put in new ones.
So I'm not sure even, and I'll ask this question, if Daryl and Jan had a chance to look at the resolution, which you don't have to give comments on tonight, but I think as we're moving towards it, that would be helpful, because I'm not sure if you've had a chance to do that. So.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what are the next steps here? And that would certainly be one of them.
Yeah, I think we've been more focused on the ordinance language. I think it was our sense that the council was the resolution was sort of to reflect your priority setting, and so I didn't really feel like it was a role for us to craft or comment.
Makes you do things. There's a resolve clause here.
Yeah,
Well,
I'd like to get
it
your
kind of will
views.
come right back around to budget, so we'll be back here in a couple of months or less. So we'll be, having that conversation as well.
And the tree commission had asked for us to double back particularly on the resolution. After tonight.
Right.
Casey's already got a plan for that.
All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Next steps.
Well, we have notes from tonight, and so we will put those together and seek out the additional information that we need from staff, and we can work with you, Skip, on some things. And I think we'll just move on from there. Once we have everything kind of in order, we can look at another work session, and hopefully that will be the last work session.
Yeah, the goal is. No, we don't have a date yet, because no. But hopefully the next work session will be the last one, and then we'll go to vote. So, all right. Any other questions or anything? All right, Councilmember Kova is ready to go home. I guess.
Stretch it.
We are adjourned.